They say nothing ever happens in small towns. I'm Officer Mike Torres, and I can tell you that's the biggest lie ever told. In fact, it's precisely because nothing is supposed to happen that when something does, it cuts deeper than any city crime. These are the cases that taught me that evil doesn't need bright lights and big crowds to thrive. I've been working the night shift in Millbrook for 8 years now. Population 3,847. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where secrets have a way of festering in the shadows, and where the most ordinary facades can hide the most extraordinary darkness. Tonight, I want to share 3 cases with you. Cases that still wake me up at 3 a.m. Cases that made me question everything I thought I knew about human nature. And cases that prove beyond any doubt that the quietest places often harbor the loudest screams. Asterisk. It was a Tuesday in March when Mrs. Henderson called the station. Her voice was shaky, uncertain. She'd been walking her dog past the old photography studio on Elm Street, the one that had been closed for 15 years, when she saw lights flickering inside. "I know it sounds silly," she said to dispatch, "but there shouldn't be anyone in there. The place has been empty since old Mr. Garrett died." I took the call. Seemed routine enough. Probably just kids breaking in, maybe some homeless person seeking shelter. The studio sat on the corner of Elm and 3rd, a 2-story brick building with large windows that had been boarded up since 2008. The sign still hung crooked above the door. Garrett Family Portraits, capturing memories since 1956. When I arrived, everything looked normal from the outside. The boards were still nailed tight across the windows. The front door was chained shut with a rusted padlock that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But Mrs. Henderson was right about one thing. There was definitely light coming from somewhere inside. I walked around to the alley behind the building. That's where I found it. A basement window, half hidden behind overgrown weeds, with the glass pane carefully removed. Not broken, removed. Someone had taken the time to extract the entire pane without damage and lean it against the brick wall. The opening was just big enough for an adult to squeeze through. I called for backup and waited. In a town like Millbrook, we don't take chances. 20 minutes later, Officer Sarah Chun arrived, and we decided to investigate together. The basement was dark, musty, filled with the smell of old chemicals and something else, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing the remnants of what had once been a developing room. Ancient enlargers sat covered in dust sheets, and shelves lined the walls, still holding bottles of chemicals that had probably been there since the 1990s. But someone had been here recently. The dust had been disturbed. Footprints led across the concrete floor, and in the corner, we found a camping chair and a thermos that was still warm. The stairs to the main floor creaked as we climbed them. Each step echoed in the empty building, and I found myself holding my breath, listening for any sound that might indicate we weren't alone. The main studio was a time capsule. Backdrop stands still in position, camera equipment covered in sheets. And along one wall, a display of sample portraits that showcased Mr. Garrett's work over the decades. Families posed stiffly in front of artificial backgrounds, children clutching toys, elderly couples marking anniversaries. But someone had been rearranging things. The portraits had been taken down and reorganized. Not randomly, there was a pattern. All the family photos had been grouped together on one side, all the individual portraits on the other. And in the center of the wall, someone had hung a new photo dot. It was a Polaroid, the kind that develops instantly. The image showed the interior of this very studio, taken from where we were standing. But the timestamp in the corner indicated it had been taken just 3 hours ago. Chun grabbed my arm. "Mike, look at the backdrop." Behind the camera equipment, the old photo backdrop had been replaced. Instead of the faded pastoral scene that Mr. Garrett had used, someone had hung a black sheet. And positioned in front of it was a single chair, not just any chair. A child's chair. We searched the rest of the building methodically. The second floor had been Mr. Garrett's apartment, and it told a story of someone who had lived alone with his work. The rooms were sparse, functional, filled with more photography equipment and filing cabinets that contained decades of client records. But in the bedroom, we found something that made my blood run cold. A modern digital camera sat on the nightstand, connected to a laptop computer. Both were plugged in, both were running. Someone had set up a remote monitoring system. The camera was pointed at the window, programmed to take a photo every 30 minutes and upload it to the laptop. When I checked the files, I found hundreds of images spanning the past 6 months. Photos of the street outside, the alley, people walking by. And photos of us. There were pictures of every police car that ever patrolled past the building. Pictures of Mrs. Henderson walking her dog. Pictures of children playing in the park across the street. But most disturbing were the photos taken inside the building. Someone had been documenting their activities here, setting up the backdrop, arranging the chair, preparing for something. The final photo in the sequence had been taken just 10 minutes before we arrived. It showed a figure in dark clothing climbing out through the basement window, but the image was too dark and blurry to make out any details. We called for the crime scene unit and spent the next 6 hours going through everything. What we found in those filing cabinets changed everything. Mr. Garrett's client records went back 50 years, but someone had been through them recently. Specific files had been pulled and organized into neat stacks. All children's portraits, all solo shots, all taken between 1975 and 1995, and written on each file folder in fresh ink was a current address, not the address from when the photo was taken. Current addresses. Someone had been tracking down the children in those old photographs, finding out where they lived now as adults. I recognized some of the names. People I'd gone to school with, neighbors, friends. The files contained not just their old photos, but newspaper clippings about their lives, printouts from social media, and in some cases, more recent photos that had clearly been taken without their knowledge. The setup in the basement made more sense now. Someone had been using the old studio as a base of operations, studying those old photographs and tracking down the people in them. But why? The answer came when we found the darkroom. Behind the main developing area, someone had set up a makeshift workspace. A table covered with photo enlargements, all blown up from the same original image. It was one of Mr. Garrett's old portraits, a school picture of a boy who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. The boy had dark hair, serious eyes, and was wearing a striped shirt. In the corner of the original photo, in Mr. Garrett's handwriting, was a date, September 1982, and a name, Timothy Morrison. Surrounding this central image were dozens of other photos. Recent photos of a man I recognized immediately. Tim Morrison worked at the hardware store downtown. He was married, had 2 kids of his own, coached Little League on weekends. Someone had been watching him. The photos showed Tim leaving work, picking up his children from school, working in his yard, eating dinner with his family at the diner on Main Street. They'd been taken with a telephoto lens from a distance, but they were clear enough to see every detail of his daily routine. And on the wall above the table, someone had written a message in red marker. Remember what you forgot. Remember what he did to you. Remember why you need to remember. The case took a disturbing turn when we brought Tim Morrison in for questioning. He sat in our small interview room, confused and frightened, insisting he had no idea why anyone would be watching him or why someone would be interested in his childhood photos. I barely remember having that picture taken, he told us. I was just a kid. My mom brought me to Mr. Garrett's studio like all the other parents did. It was just a school photo. But as we talked, details began to emerge. Tim's memories of his childhood were strangely fragmented. He remembered some things clearly: family vacations, Christmas mornings, playing with friends, but there were gaps, long periods he couldn't account for, especially around the time that photo was taken. I had a lot of problems when I was little, he admitted. My parents took me to counselors, doctors. They said I had anxiety, depression. I spent a lot of time in therapy. We contacted Tim's mother, who still lived in town. Her reaction when we mentioned the photography studio was immediate and visceral. She went pale, her hands started shaking, and she asked us to come to her house to talk. What she told us there opened up a case that had been buried for 30 years. I never wanted to believe it, she said, sitting in her living room with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When Tim started having problems, when he began acting out, having nightmares, I kept telling myself it was just a phase. But the therapist, Dr. Williams, he said there might be something else. According to Tim's mother, Dr. Williams had suspected that Tim was suffering from repressed trauma. Something had happened to him, something significant enough to cause psychological damage, but Tim had no memory of it. Dr. Williams said sometimes children block out traumatic experiences as a way of protecting themselves. He wanted to try hypnotherapy to help Tim remember, but I was too scared. I thought it might make things worse. She got up and went to a closet, returning with a box of old documents, medical records, therapy notes, and a letter from Dr. Williams to the police that had never been sent. In the letter, dated March 1983, Dr. Williams outlined his suspicions. Tim's symptoms: nightmares, behavioral regression, inexplicable fear of cameras and dark rooms, all pointed to sexual abuse. But Tim had no memory of any abuse occurring. The child speaks of the man with the camera, Dr. Williams had written. He becomes agitated when discussing photography or picture taking. In my professional opinion, Timothy has experienced significant trauma related to photographic activities, possibly in a professional setting. But the letter had never been sent. Dr. Williams had died in a car accident before he could file his report, and Tim's family had moved away from Millbrook shortly after. We reopened Mr. Garrett's death investigation. Immediately, what we'd originally attributed to natural causes, he'd been found dead in his studio in 2008. Apparently of a heart attack, now looked suspiciously convenient. We exhumed his body and found traces of digitalis in his tissue samples. Someone had poisoned him. But who? And why now, 30 years later? The answer came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the files we'd found in the studio, Sean noticed something odd about the handwriting. The current addresses written on the folders, the message on the darkroom wall, the handwriting looked familiar. She compared it to samples from our local files and found a match. The handwriting belonged to David Palmer, a man who'd been arrested twice for stalking and once for breaking and entering. But Palmer had never shown any interest in photography or children until we dug deeper. David Palmer's real name was David Garrett. He was Mr. Garrett's nephew, and he'd lived with his uncle on and off during the 1980s when his own parents were going through a difficult divorce. Palmer had been using his mother's maiden name since he turned 18 and moved away from Millbrook. He'd come back to town 6 months ago, renting a small apartment under his assumed name, and no one had made the connection. When we arrested Palmer at his apartment, we found evidence that made the scope of his activities clear. He had files on over 40 people, all former clients of his uncle's studio, all children who'd had their photos taken there during the 1980s. Palmer's apartment was a shrine to his uncle's memory. The walls were covered with Mr. Garrett's photographs, and Palmer had created detailed timelines of his uncle's life and work. But mixed in with the legitimate business records were things that made my skin crawl. Hidden behind a false wall, we found Palmer's real collection. Hundreds of photographs that had never been part of Mr. Garrett's official portfolio. Pictures of children in various states of undress, taken in poses that were clearly not normal portrait photography. And among them, we found photos of Tim Morrison. The pictures told a story that explained everything. Tim had been one of Mr. Garrett's victims, subjected to abuse during what his parents thought were routine photography sessions. Dr. Williams had been right. Tim had blocked out the trauma, but the psychological damage had been real. Palmer had grown up knowing what his uncle had done. He'd been old enough to understand, old enough to see the photos, old enough to know that his uncle was a predator. But instead of being horrified, Palmer had been inspired. "He was teaching me," Palmer told us during his confession. "Uncle Garrett showed me how to read people, how to know which children would be vulnerable, which parents wouldn't ask questions. He said it was an art form." Palmer's plan had been to contact all of his uncle's former victims to force them to remember what had happened to them. He believed that the statute of limitations on prosecuting his uncle's crimes was running out, and he wanted to document everything before it was too late. But Palmer's motives weren't justice or closure for the victims. He wanted to preserve his uncle's work for posterity. He saw himself as the curator of a horrific museum, documenting his uncle's crimes not to expose them, but to celebrate them. The poisoning of Mr. Garrett had been Palmer's first attempt to protect his uncle's legacy. When Palmer learned that Mr. Garrett was planning to destroy his hidden collection of photographs before his death, Palmer had decided to kill him first. "I couldn't let him destroy everything," Palmer explained, with a calmness that made my blood run cold. Those photographs were history. They were art. They deserved to be preserved. Palmer had spent the 15 years since his uncle's death planning his return to Millbrook. He'd tracked down the victims, studied their adult lives, and prepared to force them to confront their buried memories. His plan was to document their reactions, to create a new collection that showed the long-term effects of his uncle's work. Tim Morrison was going to be his first subject. The case ended with Palmer's conviction on charges ranging from murder to possession of child pornography to stalking. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. But the real tragedy was what we learned about the scope of Mr. Garrett's crimes. Palmer's files indicated that his uncle had abused dozens of children over a 30-year period, using his legitimate photography business as cover for his predatory behavior. Most of the victims, now adults, had no memory of what had happened to them. They'd successfully buried the trauma so deeply that it had become inaccessible. But the damage was still there: failed relationships, anxiety disorders, unexplained phobias, and depression that they'd never been able to understand. We offered counseling services to everyone we could identify, but many of them chose not to pursue it. They preferred to leave the past buried, and I can't say I blame them. Tim Morrison was different. He chose to undergo therapy to recover his memories, working with a specialist who could help him process the trauma safely. It's been 2 years now, and while it's been incredibly difficult for him and his family, he says he's glad to finally understand why certain things always felt wrong to him. The photography studio was demolished 6 months after Palmer's arrest. The city council decided that the building held too many dark memories to be renovated or repurposed. They turned the lot into a small memorial garden with a plaque that reads, "In memory of innocence lost and strength found." But sometimes, when I drive past that corner, I think about all the other small towns with their own dark secrets hidden behind respectable facades. I think about all the children who suffer in silence, all the adults who carry buried trauma, all the predators who use positions of trust and respectability to mask their crimes. Palmer was right about one thing. What happened in that studio was a kind of history. But it's not the kind of history that should be celebrated or preserved. It's the kind of history that should serve as a warning about the monsters that can hide in plain sight, wearing friendly faces and running trusted businesses and communities, where everyone knows everyone. And it's a reminder that sometimes the most important thing law enforcement can do is believe the victims, especially when they can't remember being victims at all. The second case I want to tell you about started with what seemed like the most innocent thing imaginable: a book club. The Millbrook Literary Society had been meeting every Thursday evening for over 20 years, gathering in the basement of the public library to discuss classics, contemporary fiction, and the occasional memoir. The club was small, never more than 8 or 9 members at any given time, and it attracted the kind of people you'd expect in a small-town: retired teachers, librarians, a few stay-at-home parents looking for intellectual stimulation. They were led by Margaret Holloway, a former English professor who'd moved to Millbrook after retiring from the State University. I knew about the book club because my neighbor, Janet Weber, had been a member for about 3 years. She often talked about how much she enjoyed the discussions, how Margaret had such interesting insights into literature, how the group had become like a second family to her. So when Janet stopped showing up to book club meetings in September, people noticed. At first, Margaret told the other members that Janet was dealing with a family emergency and would be back soon. When Janet didn't return by October, Margaret said she'd decided to take a break from the group to focus on her personal life. By November, Margaret was telling people that Janet had moved away to care for an elderly relative. The problem was, Janet Weber lived next door to me, and she hadn't gone anywhere. I watched her leave for work every morning and come home every evening, just like always. She worked at the bank downtown, same as she had for 15 years. She hadn't mentioned any family emergency to me or to any of our other neighbors. And when I asked her casually about the book club, she gave me a strange look and said she'd never heard of any literary society. That conversation bothered me for weeks. Janet Weber was sharp as a tack, with a memory that could rival any computer database. She wasn't the kind of person who would forget being part of a group she'd supposedly belonged to for 3 years. So I did some digging. The Millbrook Literary Society was registered with the library system, and their meeting records went back 2 decades. But when I looked at the membership lists, Janet Weber's name didn't appear anywhere. Not on current rosters, not on old sign-in sheets, not in any of the documentation. According to every official record, Janet Weber had never been a member of the book club, but I knew she had been. I'd seen her leaving the house on Thursday evenings with books under her arm. I'd heard her talking about the discussions, mentioning specific titles they'd read, quoting things Margaret had said about symbolism and themes. I'd even met Margaret Holloway briefly when she'd picked Janet up for a special meeting at her house. Something was very wrong. I started paying closer attention to the book club, conducting what I guess you could call unofficial surveillance. Every Thursday evening, I'd find reasons to be outside when their meeting time approached, watching to see who came and went from the library basement. What I observed was puzzling. The same 6 or 7 people showed up each week: Margaret Holloway, Dr. James Patterson, a retired physician, Linda Santos, who worked at the post office, Robert Chun, who owned the hardware store, Maria Gonzalez, a substitute teacher, and usually 1 or 2 others whose names I didn't know. They arrived separately between 6:30 and 7 p.m., carrying books and notebooks. They stayed until around 9 p.m. Everything appeared completely normal. Except for one thing. I never saw any of them talking about the book club outside of Thursday evenings. In a town like Millbrook, people talk. If you're part of a group, if you're reading interesting books and having engaging discussions, you mention it to friends, you recommend titles to people, you complain about difficult passages or celebrate beautiful writing. But none of the book club members ever seemed to discuss their reading with anyone else. I tested this theory by striking up conversations with several of them around town. When I mentioned books or reading to Dr. Patterson at the grocery store, he seemed genuinely puzzled by my interest. When I asked Linda Santos if she could recommend anything good to read, she told me she didn't really have time for books. These responses didn't match what I was observing every Thursday evening. The breakthrough came when I decided to talk to the library staff. Carol Murphy had been the head librarian for 30 years, and she knew everything that happened in her building. "Oh yes, the Literary Society," she said when I asked about the group. They've been meeting here for ages. Very quiet, very well behaved. Margaret Holloway handles all the arrangements. But when I asked Carol what kinds of books the group typically discussed, she looked uncertain. You know, I'm not really sure, she admitted. Margaret always brings her own materials. They don't use our collection much. I always assumed they were reading contemporary fiction, but now that you mention it, I've never actually seen any of their books. That detail stuck with me. A book club that didn't use library books, didn't discuss their reading with others, and whose members seemed to have no interest in literature. Outside of their Thursday meetings, I decided to observe one of their sessions more closely. The following Thursday, I positioned myself in the library's main reading room, which had a view down the stairs to the basement meeting area. At 7:15 p.m., I made my way downstairs, pretending to look for a book in the basement stacks. The meeting room door was closed, but I could hear voices inside. Not the animated discussion you'd expect from a book club, but something quieter, more rhythmic, almost like chanting. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. What I heard made no sense at first. Someone was reading aloud, but it wasn't a novel or poetry. It sounded like instructions, like a manual being read step by step. Remember to focus on the breathing, a woman's voice was saying. I recognized it as Margaret Holloway. Let your mind become receptive. Allow the words to settle deeply into your consciousness. Then there was silence for several minutes, followed by a man's voice asking, "How do you feel?" "Peaceful," came the response, in what sounded like Dr. Patterson's voice. "Ready to listen?" "Good," said Margaret. "Now, let's begin tonight's session." What followed was unlike any book discussion I'd ever heard. Margaret began reading what sounded like a story, but the others weren't responding with analysis or questions. Instead, they were making soft sounds of agreement, saying things like, "Yes, I see it, and that's exactly right." But the strangest part was that as I listened longer, I began to feel drowsy myself. Margaret's voice had a hypnotic quality, rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed designed to lull the listener into a trance-like state. I realized I was eavesdropping on some kind of hypnosis session, not a book club at all. I stepped away from the door and made my way back upstairs, my mind racing. What was Margaret Holloway doing to these people? And why were they willing participants in whatever was happening down there? The answer came when I researched Margaret's background more thoroughly. Before retiring to Millbrook, Professor Holloway had taught psychology at the State University, with a specialty in memory and consciousness. But her academic career had ended under troubling circumstances. She'd been accused of conducting unauthorized experiments on her students, using hypnosis to implant false memories and alter their perceptions of past events. The university had forced her to retire early, and several former students had filed complaints, alleging that she'd manipulated their memories for her own research purposes. But because the effects of her experiments were difficult to prove, and because most of the students had graduated and moved on, no formal charges had been filed. Margaret Holloway had come to Millbrook not to enjoy a peaceful retirement, but to continue her experiments away from academic oversight. I began investigating what had happened to former book club members. According to the library records, the group's membership had been fluid over the years, with people joining and leaving regularly. But when I tracked down some of the former members, I discovered a disturbing pattern. Many of them had no memory of ever being part of a book club. Like Janet Weber, they insisted they'd never belonged to any literary society and seemed genuinely confused when I mentioned Margaret Holloway's name, but others remembered the book club differently. They recalled attending meetings, but their memories were vague and fragmented. They remembered enjoying the discussions but couldn't recall any specific books they'd read. They remembered Margaret as an engaging leader, but couldn't quote anything specific she'd said. It was as if their memories of the book club existed in a fog, accessible but insubstantial. The most disturbing case was Helen Rodriguez, who'd been a member for 2 years before suddenly dropping out in 2018. When I spoke with Helen, she remembered the book club clearly, but her account was troubling. Margaret was helping us with our personal problems, Helen explained. She said that literature could be therapeutic, that by identifying with fictional characters, we could work through our own psychological issues. According to Helen, the book club meetings had gradually become more like group therapy sessions. Margaret would guide the members through discussions of books that related to their personal struggles, encouraging them to open up about traumatic experiences and painful memories. She was so understanding, Helen said. She helped me work through some difficult things from my childhood, things I'd never told anyone before. But as Helen described these therapeutic sessions, it became clear that Margaret had been doing much more than facilitating discussion. She'd been using hypnosis to access her members' repressed memories, and then manipulating those memories to serve her own purposes. Margaret helped me remember things more clearly, Helen explained. She said that sometimes our minds distort painful memories to protect us, but that it's healthier to face the truth. She helped me see that my father hadn't just been strict, he'd been abusive. The problem was, Helen's father had been a respected member of the community, known for his gentleness and devotion to his family. Her siblings had no memory of any abuse, and Helen's own recollections before joining the book club had been entirely positive. Margaret Holloway had implanted false memories of abuse, convincing Helen that her loving father had been a monster. I realized we were dealing with a predator who used psychological manipulation instead of physical force. Margaret was collecting vulnerable people, using her knowledge of hypnosis to access their deepest memories, and then altering those memories to create the narrative she wanted to study. But her experiments weren't random. As I dug deeper into the backgrounds of current and former book club members, I discovered that Margaret was targeting people with specific psychological profiles. People who'd experienced trauma, people with depression or anxiety, people who were isolated or lonely. She was drawn to damaged minds because they were easier to manipulate. The current members of the book club were all people who'd suffered significant losses or setbacks in recent years. Dr. Patterson was dealing with the death of his wife. Linda Santos was going through a difficult divorce. Robert Chen had recently lost his business to bankruptcy. Margaret had recruited them during their most vulnerable moments and was using their pain as raw material for her research. But what exactly was she trying to accomplish? The answer came when I found her real journals, hidden in a storage unit she'd rented under a false name. The journals contained detailed records of her experiments, including transcripts of hypnosis sessions and analysis of the memory alterations she'd performed. Margaret wasn't just studying memory. She was trying to prove a theory about the malleability of human consciousness. She believed that all memory was essentially fiction, that the stories we tell ourselves about our past are no more real than the plots of novels. Her book club was an elaborate experiment designed to demonstrate that she could implant any narrative into a person's mind and make them believe it was their own history. She was literally rewriting people's lives. The journals showed that she'd been working toward a specific goal, completely erasing a person's original identity and replacing it with an entirely fictional history. She called this process narrative reconstruction, and she believed it could be used to treat severe psychological trauma by giving people new, healthier life stories. But Margaret's version of healing involved destroying who people actually were and replacing them with fictional characters of her own creation. Janet Weber had been her most successful subject. Over the course of 3 years, Margaret had gradually erased Janet's memories of her real life and implanted a complex false history. In Janet's altered mind, she'd never been married, never had children, never worked at the bank. Instead, she believed she was a retired teacher who'd moved to Millbrook recently to start a new life. The Janet Weber who lived next door to me was essentially a fictional character, programmed with false memories and a constructed personality. that had no connection to her real identity. Margaret's plan was to document Janet's complete transformation and publish her findings in a psychology journal, proving that human identity was nothing more than a collection of stories that could be edited at will. We arrested Margaret Holloway at her next book club meeting, waiting until she'd put the current members into a hypnotic trance before moving in. The sight of 6 adults sitting in a circle with their eyes closed, completely unaware of their surroundings, was one of the most unsettling things I've ever encountered in police work. Margaret showed no remorse when we took her into custody. She insisted that her work was legitimate research that would revolutionize the treatment of psychological trauma. She claimed that she'd given her subjects better, happier lives by removing their painful memories and replacing them with more pleasant alternatives. These people were suffering, she told us during interrogation. I freed them from their pain. I gave them new stories, better stories. How is that different from what therapists do every day? The difference, of course, was consent and truth. Margaret's subjects had no idea what was being done to them, and their better stories were elaborate lies that disconnected them from their real lives and relationships. The recovery process for Margaret's victims was complex and heartbreaking. Working with specialists in hypnosis and memory disorders, we attempted to help them reclaim their original identities. Some were successful, gradually recovering their real memories and learning to distinguish between their actual experiences. And Margaret's implanted narratives that others were not so fortunate. Janet Weber's false memories were so deeply embedded that attempts to restore her original identity caused severe psychological distress. She preferred to live with the fictional history Margaret had given her rather than face the confusion and trauma of remembering her real life. She still lives next door to me, but she's not really the same person who used to water my plants when I was on vacation and who knew every detail of neighborhood gossip. The Janet Weber I knew is gone, replaced by a stranger who happens to inhabit the same body. Margaret Holloway was convicted on multiple charges including fraud, assault, and unlawful imprisonment. She was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison and is prohibited from practicing any form of therapy or counseling. But her victims will live with the consequences of her experiments for the rest of their lives, forever uncertain about which of their memories are real and which are the products of a predator's imagination. The Millbrook Public Library no longer allows private groups to meet in the basement, and the librarians have been trained to watch for signs of psychological manipulation or coercion. The basement meeting room sits empty most evenings now, but sometimes when I'm in the library, I imagine I can still hear the echo of Margaret's voice, weaving false realities and stealing souls one memory at a time. The case taught me that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence or obvious criminality. Sometimes it comes disguised as help, wearing the face of a teacher or healer, offering to make pain go away by replacing it with lies. And it reminded me that our memories, fragile and imperfect as they are all we really have to prove we exist. When someone steals our past, they steal our very identity, leaving us to wonder who we really are beneath the stories we tell ourselves about our lives. Asterisk. The third case began with what seemed like the best possible problem for a small town to have: too much success. In the spring of 2019, Millbrook started attracting attention from health and wellness magazines, lifestyle bloggers, and even a few minor celebrities who claimed they'd discovered the secret to perfect health in our quiet little community. Source of this sudden fame was Dr. Elena Vasquez's Millbrook Wellness Center, which had opened just 18 months earlier in a renovated Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town. Dr. Vasquez claimed to practice integrative medicine, combining traditional medical treatments with alternative therapies, nutritional counseling, and what she called lifestyle optimization. The center was beautiful, I'll give her that. The old Victorian had been completely restored, painted in soothing pastels and surrounded by carefully maintained gardens filled with medicinal herbs and vegetables. Inside, the rooms had been converted into treatment spaces, meditation areas, and consultation offices that looked more like luxury hotel suites than medical facilities. But what really drew people to the center wasn't the aesthetics, it was the results. Dr. Vasquez's patients reported miraculous improvements in their health within weeks of beginning her programs. People with chronic pain found relief. Those with depression experienced dramatic mood improvements, and several clients claimed to have been cured of serious medical conditions that had plagued them for years. The testimonials were impressive and specific. Martha Collins, who'd suffered from debilitating arthritis for a decade, was suddenly able to garden and walk long distances without pain. Tom Bradley, a diabetic since his 20s, reported that his blood sugar levels had normalized for the first time in 15 years. Sarah Martinez, who'd struggled with severe anxiety and panic attacks, became calm and confident seemingly overnight. Word of these miraculous recoveries spread quickly, and soon people were traveling from hundreds of miles away to become patients at the Millbrook Wellness Center. The center's waiting list grew to over 6 months, and Dr. Vasquez began charging fees that would have been considered outrageous for a small-town medical practice. Asterisk. But nobody complained about the cost because the treatment seemed to work. At least, that's what everyone believed until Marcus Webb came to see me in late September. Marcus was a local contractor who'd been one of Dr. Vasquez's early patients. He'd sought treatment for chronic back pain that had been limiting his ability to work, and according to everyone who knew him, the treatment had been a complete success. Marcus had been pain-free for over a year, able to take on physically demanding jobs that he'd had to turn down previously. So I was surprised when Marcus showed up at the police station, looking haggard and frightened, insisting that something terrible was happening at the wellness center. "Officer Torres," he said, slumping into the chair across from my desk, "I need to tell you something about Dr. Vasquez's place. Something that's going to sound crazy, but I swear it's true." Marcus looked like he hadn't slept in days. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his hand shook slightly as he spoke, and his eyes had the darting, paranoid quality I'd learned to associate with people under extreme stress. "Take your time," I told him. "Tell me what's going on." "It's about my back pain," he began. "Everyone thinks Dr. Vasquez cured me, and for a long time I thought so too. The pain was gone, completely gone. I could work 12-hour days, lift heavy materials, do everything I used to do before the injury. It was like a miracle." He paused, running his hands through his hair. "But last month, I missed an appointment. I was working on a job that ran late, and I couldn't make it to the center for my regular session. Dr. Vasquez was understanding about it, said we could reschedule for the following week. What kind of sessions were you having?" I asked. "That's just it, I'm not really sure," Marcus admitted. Dr. Vasquez said they were a combination of deep tissue massage, acupuncture, and something she called neurological recalibration. The sessions took place in a special room in the basement, and she said the treatments were most effective if I relaxed completely during them. Marcus described sessions where Dr. Vasquez would have him lie on a massage table while she performed what felt like conventional physical therapy. But there were also elements that seemed unusual: electrodes attached to his temples, headphones that played what she called therapeutic frequencies, and injections that she said were vitamin supplements designed to enhance the healing process. "The thing is, I always felt incredibly relaxed during these sessions," Marcus continued. "So relaxed that I usually fell asleep. Dr. Vasquez said that was normal, that deep healing required the body to enter a state of complete rest. But when Marcus missed that appointment in August, something changed. The pain started coming back. Gradually," he explained. "At first, just little twinges when I bent over or lifted something heavy. But by the end of the week, it was almost as bad as it had been before I started treatment." Marcus had called the wellness center to schedule an emergency appointment, explaining that his pain was returning. Dr. Vasquez had been sympathetic and understanding, bringing him in immediately for what she called a maintenance session. After That appointment, the pain disappeared again, Marcus said. Dr. Vasquez explained that some patients needed regular follow-up treatments to maintain their progress. She said it was perfectly normal and nothing to worry about. But Marcus had started to worry anyway. Over the following weeks, he began paying closer attention to his symptoms and to the timing of his appointments. I realized that the pain always started to return exactly 1 week after my last session, he told me. Not gradually over time, like you'd expect with a chronic condition. It came back on a schedule, like clockwork. That discovery had led Marcus to conduct his own experiment. He'd deliberately missed another appointment to see what would happen. The pain came back right on schedule, he said. But this time, I decided to tough it out, to see if my body would readjust naturally without Dr. Vasquez's treatments. What happened next terrified him. It wasn't just the back pain, Marcus explained, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. I started having other symptoms. Severe headaches, nausea, muscle spasms, night sweats. It felt like withdrawal, like my body was addicted to whatever Dr. Vasquez had been giving me. Marcus had suffered through these symptoms for 2 weeks before, finally giving in and scheduling another appointment. But this time, he'd been more observant during the session. I pretended to fall asleep like usual, but I stayed conscious, he said. I wanted to see exactly what she was doing to me. What Marcus witnessed during that session changed his entire understanding of his treatment. The injections weren't vitamins, he said. Dr. Vasquez was giving me opioids. Powerful ones based on how they made me feel. And the electrodes weren't for therapy, they were connected to some kind of electrical stimulation device that she used while I was unconscious. But most disturbing of all was what Marcus overheard during the session. Dr. Vasquez was talking to someone on the phone while she worked on me, he continued. She was discussing my case like I was some kind of experiment. She said things like, Subject 23 is responding well to the conditioning protocol, and we should be able to maintain dependency for at least another 6 months. Marcus realized that his miraculous recovery hadn't been a cure at all. Dr. Vasquez had been managing his pain through a combination of powerful drugs and psychological conditioning, creating a dependency that required regular maintenance to prevent withdrawal symptoms. I'm not cured, Marcus said, his voice breaking. I'm an addict. She turned me into an addict, and now I can't function without her treatments. The implications of Marcus's story were staggering. If Dr. Vasquez was using similar methods with other patients, then the wellness center's remarkable success rate was built on systematic drug dependency rather than legitimate medical treatment. But proving this would be challenging. Marcus had no physical evidence of his claims, and his accusations could easily be dismissed as the paranoid delusions of someone experiencing withdrawal symptoms. I decided to investigate quietly, starting with the other patients who'd experienced dramatic improvements at the wellness center. What I found was a pattern that supported Marcus's allegations. Martha Collins, the arthritis patient who'd reportedly been cured, had become a virtual recluse since beginning treatment at the wellness center. She rarely left her house except for her twice-weekly appointments with Dr. Vasquez, and neighbors reported that she seemed confused and disoriented on the few occasions when they saw her. Tom Bradley, the diabetic whose blood sugar had supposedly normalized, had actually been hospitalized twice in recent months for hypoglycemic episodes. His medical records showed that his blood sugar levels were wildly erratic, swinging from dangerously low to dangerously high with no apparent pattern. Sarah Martinez, who'd overcome her anxiety and panic attacks, had developed what appeared to be agoraphobia. She'd quit her job, ended her relationship, and isolated herself from friends and family. The only person she maintained regular contact with was Dr. Vasquez. Every patient I investigated showed signs of psychological and physical dependency that were inconsistent with legitimate medical treatment, but when I approached them directly, trying to ask questions about their experiences at the wellness center, Their responses were eerily similar to each other and disturbingly vague. They all described their treatments in nearly identical terms, using phrases that sounded rehearsed. They all insisted that Dr. Vasquez was a miracle worker who'd saved their lives. And they all became agitated and defensive when I suggested that there might be problems with their treatment. It was as if they'd been programmed to respond in specific ways to questions about the wellness center. I decided I needed to see the center's operation firsthand, so I made an appointment for a consultation under the pretense of seeking treatment for chronic insomnia. Dr. Elena Vasquez was an elegant woman in her 50s, with silver hair and the kind of serene confidence that made you want to trust her immediately. Her office was decorated with diplomas from prestigious medical schools, awards from health organizations, and testimonial letters from grateful patients. During our consultation, Dr. Vasquez was warm, attentive, and thoroughly professional. She asked detailed questions about my sleep problems, took a comprehensive medical history, and explained her treatment philosophy with impressive knowledge and conviction. Traditional medicine treats symptoms, she told me. Integrative medicine treats the whole person. We address not just the immediate problem, but the underlying imbalances that created the problem in the first place. Dr. Vasquez's proposed treatment plan for my insomnia involved a combination of nutritional supplements, meditation training, and what she called deep relaxation therapy that would take place in her specialized treatment room. Many of my patients find the deep relaxation sessions to be the most beneficial part of their treatment, she explained. We use advanced biofeedback technology to help your nervous system learn to achieve truly restorative sleep states. Everything about Dr. Vasquez and her approach seemed legitimate and professional. If I hadn't spoken with Marcus Webb first, I would have been completely convinced that she was exactly what she appeared to be, a dedicated physician using innovative methods to help people heal. But I was looking for signs of deception, and I found them in small details that might not have been apparent to someone seeking genuine treatment. Dr. Vasquez's questions about my medical history focused heavily on my psychological state, my relationships with family and friends, and my social support network. She seemed particularly interested in whether I lived alone, whether I had close friends I confided in, and whether I had any ongoing medical care with other physicians. She also asked about my work schedule, my financial situation, and my long-term plans for staying in Millbrook. These questions seemed tangential to treating insomnia, but they would be crucial information for someone planning to create dependency in a patient. When I agreed to begin treatment, Dr. Vasquez scheduled my first deep relaxation session for the following week and gave me a bottle of herbal supplements to take in the meantime. These will help prepare your system for the deeper work we'll be doing, she explained. Take 2 capsules each evening before bed and keep a sleep diary so we can track your progress. I had the supplements analyzed by a lab outside of town, and the results confirmed my suspicions. The herbal supplements contained a mixture of benzodiazepines and synthetic opioids, powerful drugs that would indeed improve sleep in the short term while creating physical dependency. But I needed more evidence before I could move forward with an investigation. Dr. Vasquez was too careful, too professional to be caught through simple observation or questioning. I decided to go through with the scheduled treatment session, wearing a hidden recording device and arranging for backup officers to monitor the situation from outside the building. The treatment room in the basement of the wellness center was exactly as Marcus had described it. A comfortable space with soft lighting, soothing music, and medical equipment that looked legitimate but served sinister purposes. Dr. Vasquez had me lie on a padded table while she attached electrodes to my temples and arms. She explained that these would monitor my nervous system activity during the session, helping her optimize the treatment for my specific needs. The key to effective deep relaxation is letting go completely, she told me as she prepared an injection. This is a mild sedative that will help you achieve the level of nervous system rest that's necessary for healing to occur. I allowed her to give me the injection, having taken a mild stimulant beforehand that would counteract the sedative effects without being detectable. As she expected me to lose consciousness, I regulated my breathing and closed my eyes, pretending to fall into the drug-induced sleep that she was counting on. What I witnessed over the next hour was a systematic process of psychological and physical manipulation. Once Dr. Vasquez believed I was unconscious, she began the real treatment. The electrodes attached to my head were connected to a device that delivered precisely calibrated electrical stimulation to specific areas of my brain. According to the settings I could observe on the machine, these pulses were designed to interfere with memory formation and enhance suggestibility. While the electrical stimulation continued, Dr. Vasquez began speaking to me in a low, rhythmic voice, delivering what was clearly a scripted series of suggestions and commands. "You are feeling better already," she said. "The treatments at this center are helping you heal in ways that no other medicine could. You trust Dr. Vasquez completely. You know that she is the only person who can help you maintain your health." The suggestions continued for nearly 30 minutes, covering everything from my perception of the treatment's effectiveness to my willingness to continue therapy, regardless of cost or inconvenience. But the most disturbing part of the session was what came next. Dr. Vasquez made a phone call to someone she referred to as the coordinator, providing a detailed report on my session. "Subject 47 is responding well to initial conditioning," she said. "Baseline dependency should be established within 3 sessions. I recommend maintaining the standard protocol and scheduling integration assessment for next month." The conversation made it clear that my treatment was part of a larger operation, with multiple subjects being processed according to established protocols. Dr. Vasquez wasn't working alone. She was part of an organized network that was systematically creating drug-dependent patients for purposes I couldn't yet understand. After the phone call, Dr. Vasquez spent another 20 minutes adjusting the electrical stimulation and delivering additional suggestions designed to reinforce my supposed belief in her treatments. When the session ended, she gradually reduced the electrical stimulation and waited for me to wake up naturally from the sedative. "How do you feel?" she asked as I pretended to regain consciousness. "Relaxed," I replied honestly, though not for the reasons she believed. "Very peaceful." "Excellent," Dr. Vasquez said, making notes in my file. "That's exactly the response we want to see. I think you're going to do very well with this treatment protocol." She scheduled my next session for the following week and gave me another bottle of supplements, these ones containing a higher dose of addictive substances designed to increase my dependency between sessions. That evening, I met with Chief of Police Robert Davidson and Agent Sarah Chun from the State Bureau of Investigation to plan our response. The evidence I'd gathered was sufficient to open a formal investigation, but we needed to be careful about how we proceeded. If Dr. Vasquez is part of a larger network, we want to avoid alerting them before we understand the full scope of their operation, Agent Chun explained. "We'll need to coordinate with federal agencies and possibly other states if this turns out to be interstate trafficking." Our investigation expanded rapidly as we began analyzing the wellness center's patient records, financial transactions, and communications. What we discovered was a criminal enterprise that went far beyond simple medical fraud. Dr. Vasquez was indeed part of a network, but not the kind we'd initially expected. The wellness center was a front for a human trafficking operation that specialized in creating psychologically dependent victims who could be exploited for various purposes. The patients who showed dramatic improvements weren't being cured. They were being processed through a systematic program of chemical dependency and psychological conditioning that rendered them completely compliant and controllable. Some victims, like Marcus Webb, were being maintained as long-term dependents. who would pay any amount for continued access to their treatments. Others were being prepared for trafficking to other locations, where their dependency and conditioning made them ideal candidates for forced labor or sexual exploitation. The most severely conditioned victims, like Sarah Martinez, were essentially being erased as independent people, their personalities and memories altered through a combination of drugs and electroshock therapy until they became blank slates who could be programmed with any identity their traffickers desired. Dr. Vasquez's impressive credentials were real. She was a licensed physician who'd trained at legitimate medical schools. But she'd been recruited by the trafficking network, specifically because her medical knowledge allowed her to implement their conditioning protocols with scientific precision. The network had chosen Millbrook as their base of operations precisely because it was a small town where an unusual medical practice wouldn't attract immediate scrutiny. The center's reputation for miraculous cures had provided perfect cover for their actual activities, allowing them to operate for over a year without detection. When we arrested Dr. Vasquez and raided the wellness center, we found evidence of over 60 victims who'd been processed through their program. Some were still in town, living as dependent patients who believed they were receiving life-saving medical treatment. Others had been shipped to locations across the country, their fates unknown. The basement of the wellness center contained a fully equipped medical facility designed for psychological conditioning and memory alteration. In addition to the treatment room I'd experienced, there were isolation cells, surgical suites, and a laboratory for manufacturing the specialized drugs used in their protocols. Dr. Vasquez's personal records revealed the scientific methodology behind their operation. She developed precise formulas for creating specific types of dependency and conditioning, treating human minds like machines that could be reprogrammed according to predetermined specifications. The recovery process for the victims was complex and heartbreaking. Many of them had been so thoroughly conditioned that they couldn't accept the reality of their situation. They insisted that Dr. Vasquez had saved their lives and begged to be allowed to continue their treatments. Marcus Webb was among the fortunate ones who were able to overcome their conditioning with proper medical support and therapy. But his recovery required months of carefully managed withdrawal from the drugs he'd been given, combined with extensive counseling to help him distinguish between his real memories and the false beliefs that had been implanted during his sessions. The hardest part, Marcus told me later, was accepting that none of my improvement had been real. I'd been living in a carefully constructed delusion, believing I was healthy when I was actually sicker than I'd ever been. Other victims were not as fortunate. Some had been so severely damaged by the conditioning process that they required long-term psychiatric care. A few never fully recovered their original personalities, remaining dependent on institutional support for the rest of their lives. Dr. Vasquez was convicted on federal charges including human trafficking, medical fraud, and aggravated assault. She was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. But during her trial, she showed no remorse for her actions, insisting that her work represented a breakthrough in medical science that could benefit humanity. I was helping these people achieve their full potential, she testified. Traditional medicine focuses on treating disease. I was creating perfect health by optimizing human consciousness. The other members of her network proved more difficult to prosecute. Many of them operated behind layers of shell companies and false identities, using sophisticated methods to avoid detection by law enforcement. While we were able to shut down their Millbrook operation, similar centers were almost certainly operating. In other locations, the Millbrook Wellness Center building was demolished 6 months after the arrests. The site is now a small park with a memorial garden dedicated to the victims of medical exploitation. But the case taught me that evil can wear a white coat as easily as it can hide behind any other respectable facade. The most dangerous predators are often those who use their professional authority and scientific knowledge to victimize people who come to them seeking help. Dr. Vasquez had turned the fundamental trust between doctor and patient into a weapon, using her medical expertise not to heal, but to harm in ways that were sophisticated, systematic, and nearly undetectable. The case also reinforced something I'd learned from my previous investigations. In small towns, we're often unprepared for the level of sophistication that modern criminals can bring to their operations. We expect our problems to be simple and our criminals to be obvious. But the reality is that organized crime has learned to exploit our assumptions about small-town safety and simplicity. The people who came to Millbrook seeking miraculous cures found something far more sinister. Perfectly engineered system for stealing their identities, their autonomy, and their lives. And if Marcus Webb hadn't found the courage to come forward with his suspicions, that system might still be operating today, hidden behind the respectable facade of a wellness center that promised healing but delivered only exploitation. It was October when the calls started coming in about Miss Rachel Hartwell's classroom. Parents were concerned because their children were coming home with stories that didn't quite add up, tales of lessons that seemed too advanced, too dark, too focused on subjects that had nothing to do with the third-grade curriculum. Miss Hartwell had been teaching at Millbrook Elementary for only 2 months, having been hired quickly when the previous teacher resigned unexpectedly at the start of the school year. She came with excellent references from schools in other states, glowing recommendations that praised her innovative teaching methods and her ability to connect with challenging students. The children loved her. That was the first thing every parent mentioned when they called to express their concerns. Their kids were excited about school in a way they'd never been before, eager to get to class each morning and reluctant to leave in the afternoon. But the things the children were learning troubled their parents. 8-year-old Tommy Martinez came home talking about the dark games that Miss Hartwell taught them during free time. When his mother asked him to explain, Tommy described activities that sounded more like psychological exercises than elementary school games. "We sit in a circle and Miss Hartwell tells us to close our eyes," Tommy explained. "Then she asks us to think about scary things that happened to us or things that made us sad. She says if we share the scary things, they won't be scary anymore." Sarah Kim's daughter Lisa had started having nightmares after similar sessions. Lisa described exercises where Miss Hartwell would have the children write letters to family members. They'd never met deceased grandparents, estranged relatives, even imaginary siblings. "Miss Hartwell says everyone has secrets in their family," Lisa told her mother. "She says children can help their families by finding out what the secrets are." But the most disturbing reports came from the Jensen family. Their son Michael had always been a happy, outgoing child, but after 2 months in Miss Hartwell's class, he'd become withdrawn and anxious. He'd started asking his parents strange questions about their past, about relatives he'd never heard of, about events that had happened before he was born. "Michael asked me if I'd ever hurt anyone," Mrs. Jensen told me during our interview. "When I asked him why he wanted to know, he said Miss Hartwell told the class that all grown-ups have done bad things they don't want to talk about." The breaking point came when Michael came home with a homework assignment that made his parents' blood run cold. Miss Hartwell had asked the children to interview their parents about the worst thing they'd ever done and write a report about it for class. When the Jensens called the school to complain, they were told that Miss Hartwell was implementing a new emotional literacy curriculum designed to help children develop empathy and understanding. Principal Davidson assured them that the activities were pedagogically sound, and Principal Davidson assured them that the activities were pedagogically sound and age-appropriate, but other parents weren't convinced. When they tried to observe Miss Hartwell's classroom during the school day, they were told that outside observers would disrupt the learning environment and that the new curriculum required a closed classroom setting to be effective. The situation escalated when Dr. Patricia Williams, A child psychologist whose daughter attended Millbrook Elementary requested a meeting with Miss Hartwell to discuss the curriculum. Dr. Williams was concerned about the psychological impact of the activities. Her daughter described. Miss Hartwell agreed to meet. But when Dr. Williams arrived at the scheduled time, she found the classroom empty. According to the school secretary, Miss Hartwell had called in sick that morning. When Dr. Williams rescheduled for the following week, Miss Hartwell was mysteriously unavailable again. That's when Dr. Williams called me. "Officer Torres," she said during our phone conversation, "I've been working with children for 15 years, and I've never encountered a teacher who so systematically avoided meeting with parents. Combined with the psychological exercises my daughter describes, I'm concerned that something inappropriate is happening in that classroom." I decided to investigate, starting with Miss Hartwell's background and credentials. What I found was deeply troubling. Rachel Hartwell's teaching certificate was legitimate, issued by the State Education Department just 3 months before she was hired at Millbrook Elementary. But when I traced her previous employment history, I discovered significant gaps and inconsistencies. The schools that had supposedly provided her references had no record of employing anyone named Rachel Hartwell. The addresses listed on her resume led to empty lots or businesses that had been closed for years. Even her teaching degree from Pacific Northwest University couldn't be verified. The university had no record of anyone by that name graduating from their education program. Rachel Hartwell's entire professional history appeared to be fabricated. Brought my findings to Principal Davidson, expecting him to be shocked and immediately concerned. Instead, his reaction was defensive and evasive. "Miss Hartwell's credentials were thoroughly checked before she was hired," he insisted. "I personally spoke with references from her previous positions. There must be some kind of administrative error in the records you're looking at." When I asked Davidson to provide copies of the reference checks he'd supposedly conducted, he claimed that the documentation was in storage and would take several days to locate. When I offered to wait while he searched for the files, he became agitated and suggested that I was overstepping my authority by questioning the school's hiring practices. Principal Davidson's defensive reaction convinced me that something was seriously wrong. Either he was incompetent enough to hire someone without properly checking their credentials, or he was complicit in whatever Miss Hartwell was actually doing at the school. I decided to conduct surveillance of Miss Hartwell's activities outside of school hours. What I observed over the following week was a pattern of behavior that had nothing to do with teaching and everything to do with intelligence gathering. Miss Hartwell lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of town, but she rarely spent time there. Instead, she drove to different locations around Millbrook each evening, conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance activities. I watched her park outside the homes of her students' families, sitting in her car for hours while taking notes and photographs. I saw her follow parents to grocery stores, restaurants, and other public places, always maintaining a careful distance but clearly observing their activities. On Tuesday evening, I followed her to the public library where she spent 3 hours in the archives section, reviewing old newspaper articles and public records. When I checked after she left, I found that she'd been researching the family histories of her students' parents, looking up birth records, marriage certificates, divorce proceedings, and criminal backgrounds. Miss Hartwell wasn't just teaching the children in her classroom, she was conducting a comprehensive investigation into their families' private lives. But why? What was she looking for, and who was she working for? The answer came when I observed her meeting with someone at a coffee shop in the neighboring town of Cedar Falls. The man she met was in his 50s, well-dressed, and carried himself with the kind of authority that suggested law enforcement or military background. Their conversation was brief and businesslike, with Miss Hartwell handing over a manila folder and receiving what appeared to be cash in return. I ran the license plate of the man's car and discovered that it was registered to a private investigation firm based in Seattle. When I contacted the firm, they claimed to have no knowledge of any operations in the Millbrook area and insisted that the vehicle had been reported stolen several weeks earlier. The stolen car and false identity suggested that Miss Hartwell was part of a much more sophisticated operation than I'd initially suspected. Decided to search her apartment while she was at school, obtaining a warrant based on the evidence of fraud and potential child endangerment. What we found there confirmed my worst fears about Miss Hartwell's true purpose in Millbrook. The apartment was set up like a surveillance command center. The walls were covered with detailed charts showing the family trees, financial information, and personal histories of every family with children in her classroom. She had photographs of family members, copies of private documents, and extensive notes about each family's vulnerabilities and secrets. But most disturbing were the files, labeled with specific objectives for each family. The Martinez family file contained notes about Tommy's father's undocumented immigration status and plans for using that information to force the family's cooperation with unspecified demands. The Kim family file focused on Sarah's mother's gambling debts and her vulnerability to financial coercion. The Jensen family file detailed Michael's father's history of alcoholism and his fear of losing custody of his children. Miss Hartwell had been using her position as a teacher to gather blackmail material on the families of her students. But blackmail for what purpose? The answer was in a separate set of files labeled Phase 2 Implementation. According to these documents, Miss Hartwell was working for a human trafficking organization that specialized in acquiring children from middle-class families through coercion rather than abduction. By gathering compromising information about the parents, the organization could force families to voluntarily surrender their children for temporary custody arrangements that would become permanent. The psychological exercises that had concerned the parents weren't just inappropriate teaching methods, they were sophisticated interrogation techniques designed to extract information about family secrets and vulnerabilities that could be used for blackmail. Miss Hartwell had been training the children to become unwitting intelligence agents against their own families. The files showed that the organization had successfully operated this scheme in at least 12 other communities, always using carefully crafted false identities and legitimate institutions like schools to gain access to children and families. Millbrook was just their latest target, chosen because of its isolation, its tight-knit community structure, and its lack of resources for conducting thorough background checks on new employees. We arrested Miss Hartwell at the school during lunch break, timing the arrest to minimize trauma to the children who had trusted her. When we took her into custody, she showed no emotion or surprise, as if she'd been expecting this outcome. During interrogation, Miss Hartwell revealed the full scope of the organization's operations. She was part of a network that included corrupt education officials who helped place fake teachers in school systems, private investigators who conducted family research, and trafficking coordinators who managed the acquisition and transport of children. The families never know what's happening until it's too late, she explained with chilling matter-of-factness. By the time we make contact with the parents, we have enough information to destroy their lives if they don't cooperate. Most people will give up anything to protect their secrets. Miss Hartwell's organization had been operating for over 5 years, successfully trafficking dozens of children by exploiting parents' fears and vulnerabilities. The children were sold to wealthy buyers who wanted to acquire kids without going through legal adoption processes, often for purposes that didn't bear thinking about. Principal Davidson was arrested as an accomplice. His investigation revealed that he'd been recruited by the organization specifically to facilitate the placement of their operatives in school systems. He'd received substantial payments for his cooperation and helped create false documentation to support Miss Hartwell's fraudulent credentials. The case expanded into a federal investigation that ultimately led to the arrest of over 30 people across 8 states. The organization's leaders were convicted on federal trafficking charges and sentenced to life imprisonment, while lower-level operatives like Miss Hartwell received sentences ranging from 20 to 30 years. The children in Miss Hartwell's classroom required extensive counseling to help them understand that the games and exercises they'd participated in weren't their fault, and that they hadn't done anything wrong by answering their teachers' questions. Dr. Williams worked with the school district to develop new protocols for screening teachers and monitoring classroom activities to prevent similar infiltrations in the future. The case taught me that predators who target children have become increasingly sophisticated in their methods, using legitimate institutions and professional credentials to gain access to victims. The traditional assumption that schools are safe environments, protected by background checks and oversight, proved to be dangerously naive. Miss Hartwell's operation succeeded as long as it did, because she understood how to exploit the trust that communities place in their educational institutions. Parents naturally assumed that someone who had been hired to teach their children must be safe and trustworthy, making them vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation. The psychological damage to the families involved was severe and long-lasting. Many parents struggled with guilt over not recognizing the signs of their children's exploitation sooner, while the children had to come to terms with the fact that a trusted authority figure had used their innocence against them. Millbrook Elementary implemented new security measures and screening procedures, but the damage to the community's sense of safety was irreparable. The knowledge that predators could infiltrate even the most trusted institutions made everyone more suspicious and less trusting of newcomers. The case served as a reminder that in our interconnected world, even small, isolated communities are vulnerable to sophisticated criminal enterprises that can exploit our assumptions about safety and trust. The call came in on a Wednesday morning in November, just as the first snow was beginning to fall. Margaret Chun from the Historical Society was on the line, her voice tight with worry. "Officer Torres, I need to report something strange happening at the museum. Someone has been breaking in at night, but they're not stealing anything. They're rearranging things." The Millbrook Historical Museum occupied a converted Victorian mansion on Elm Street, filled with artifacts, documents, and photographs that chronicled the town's 150-year history. Margaret had been the volunteer curator for over a decade, meticulously cataloging and preserving everything from Civil War letters to high school yearbooks. "What kind of rearrangements?" I asked. "That's what's so odd," Margaret explained. "Whoever is doing this clearly knows our collection very well. They're not randomly moving things around, they're creating new displays, reorganizing exhibits, almost like they're trying to tell a different story about our town's history." When I arrived at the museum, Margaret showed me what she meant. The main exhibition hall had been completely rearranged overnight. Display cases that had showcased Millbrook's founding families were now focused on industrial accidents and labor disputes from the early 1900s, a section that had celebrated the town's role in World War II now emphasized the controversy over German Poes who had been housed at a local camp. "It's like someone is trying to highlight all the negative aspects of our history while downplaying the positive achievements," Margaret said, but the changes weren't random or vindictive. They were scholarly, well-researched, and accompanied by meticulously written placards that provided historical context and documentation for claims that Margaret had never encountered before. "Some of these interpretations are actually quite sophisticated," she admitted. "Whoever is doing this has access to primary sources and historical documents that I didn't even know existed." I examined the museum's security system and found that the intruder had gained access through a basement window that showed signs of careful manipulation rather than forced entry. The alarm system had been disabled from inside the building, suggesting that the intruder had extensive knowledge of the museum's layout and security protocols. More puzzling was the fact that nothing had been stolen. Valuable artifacts remained untouched, and even the petty cash in Margaret's desk drawer was undisturbed. The intruder's only interest seemed to be in reinterpreting the historical narrative presented by the museum. Has anyone expressed interest in revising the museum's exhibits recently? I asked Margaret. Actually, yes, she said. About 6 months ago, a man named Dr. Harrison Wells contacted me about doing research on Millbrook's industrial history. He said he was writing a book about labor conditions in small manufacturing towns during the early 1900s. Margaret described Dr. Wells as a distinguished academic in his 60s, claiming to be a professor emeritus from the State University. He had impressive credentials and seemed genuinely knowledgeable about historical research methods. He spent several weeks going through our archives, Margaret continued. He was particularly interested in documents related to the old textile mill and the mining operations that used to exist north of town. He seemed to know more about some aspects of our history than I did. But when Dr. Wells had proposed creating a new permanent exhibit focusing on Millbrook's industrial heritage, the Historical Society's board had rejected his proposal. They felt that his interpretation was too negative, emphasizing worker exploitation and environmental damage, rather than the economic progress and community development that the mills and mines had brought to the area. Dr. Wells seemed disappointed by the board's decision, Margaret recalled. He said something about how communities often prefer comfortable myths to uncomfortable truths. I thought he was just being academic about it, but now I'm wondering if he decided to create his own exhibit without our permission. I decided to investigate Dr. Wells's background and credentials. What I found was troubling. Harrison Wells was indeed a real professor emeritus from the State University, but he had died 2 years earlier. Someone had been using his identity to gain access to historical archives and research facilities across the region. The fake Dr. Wells had created an elaborate persona complete with forged university credentials, published research papers, and letters of recommendation. He'd used this identity to gain access to historical collections in at least 6 different towns, always focusing on industrial history and labor relations. But why would someone go to such elaborate lengths to research small-town history? And why was he so interested in revising established historical narratives? The answer began to emerge when I examined the specific changes that had been made to the museum exhibits. The fake Dr. Wells wasn't just highlighting negative aspects of Millbrook's past, he was systematically exposing cover-ups and revising sanitized versions of historical events. The new displays included information about industrial accidents that had been hushed up, environmental contamination that had been ignored, and labor disputes that had been suppressed. Most significantly, he had created an entirely new section, focused on the disappearance of several families during the 1920s, according to the documentation he'd provided. At least 12 families had left Millbrook suddenly between 1923 and 1925, abandoning their homes and businesses without explanation. The official records suggested that these families had simply moved away to seek better opportunities elsewhere. But the fake Dr. Wells's research indicated something much more sinister. Using newspaper archives, court records, and private correspondence that he'd somehow obtained, he had documented evidence of a systematic campaign of intimidation and violence directed against families who had opposed the expansion of mining operations in the area. The disappeared families had all been involved in organizing resistance to a proposed copper mine that would have displaced dozens of homes and destroyed a significant portion of the town's watershed. Their disappearances had effectively ended the opposition movement, allowing the mining company to proceed with their plans, but the mine had never been built. According to the historical record, the mining company had abandoned the project due to economic factors. The fake Dr. Wells's research suggested that the project had been abandoned because it had been a cover for something else entirely. I decided to investigate the site of the proposed mine, located about 10 miles north of town on what was now state forest land. What I found there challenged everything I thought I knew about Millbrook's history. The site showed clear evidence of extensive excavation work that had been deliberately concealed. Large areas had been dug up and then carefully reforested to hide the disturbance. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a complex network of underground chambers and tunnels that extended far beyond what would have been necessary for a copper mining operation. When we excavated one of the smaller chambers, we found evidence that confirmed the fake Dr. Wells's research and revealed something much worse than historical cover-ups. The chamber contained human remains. Not just one or two bodies, but dozens of them, carefully buried and arranged in a way that suggested systematic execution rather than accidental death. The forensic analysis revealed that the victims had died sometime in the 1920s, consistent with the time frame when the families had disappeared. But more disturbing was the evidence of how they had died. The victims showed signs of prolonged captivity and systematic torture before their execution. They had been held in underground chambers for extended periods, subjected to interrogation and abuse, before finally being killed and buried. The fake Dr. Wells's research had led us to what appeared to be a mass grave containing the bodies of people who had been murdered for opposing the mining project. But who was the fake Dr. Wells? And how had he known where to look for this evidence? The answer came when we finally tracked him down to a cabin in the state forest, not far from the excavation site. The man calling himself Dr. Harrison Wells was actually David Morrison, the great-grandson of one of the families that had disappeared. In 1925, his family's real history had been hidden for nearly a century, but David had spent decades researching what had really happened to his ancestors. "My great-grandfather was Thomas Morrison," David explained when we arrested him. He led the opposition to the mining project because he knew it was a cover for something else. The mining company was actually a front for bootleggers who wanted to use the underground chambers to store and distribute illegal alcohol during Prohibition. According to David's research, the mining project had been designed to create a massive underground storage and distribution network for illegal alcohol. The families who opposed the project weren't just fighting environmental destruction. They were threatening to expose a major criminal enterprise that involved corrupt local officials and organized crime figures from Chicago. When legal intimidation didn't work, they kidnapped the opposition leaders and their families, David continued. They tortured them to find out who else might know about the operation, then killed them to eliminate any witnesses. The murders had been covered up by local officials who were part of the bootlegging operation. The official story about families moving away had been created to explain their disappearances, and the mining project had been abandoned. Once the opposition was eliminated, David had been trying to expose this historical cover-up through legitimate academic channels, but he'd encountered resistance from local historical societies and government officials who preferred to maintain the sanitized version of events. "I tried for years to get people to listen to the evidence," David said, "but no one wanted to hear that their community was built on mass murder and corruption. So I decided to force them to confront the truth by putting it on display where they couldn't ignore it." David's guerrilla museum exhibits were his way of ensuring that the true story of his family's murder would finally be told, even if it had to be done without official permission. The discovery of the mass grave led to a major historical and criminal investigation. Federal authorities took over the case, working with historians and forensic experts to fully document what had happened in the 1920s. The investigation revealed that the bootlegging operation had been much larger than David had suspected, involving corrupt officials at the county and state level. Several prominent Millbrook families owed their wealth and influence to profits from the illegal alcohol trade, and they had helped cover up the murders to protect their own interests. David Morrison was charged with breaking and entering and impersonating an academic, but the charges were eventually dropped in light of the significance of his discoveries. The Historical Society worked with him to create a permanent exhibit documenting the true story of the disappeared families and the bootlegging operation that had led to their murders. The case forced Millbrook to confront a dark chapter in its history that had been deliberately hidden for nearly a century. The comfortable narrative of steady progress and community harmony was replaced by a more complex and disturbing truth about the violence and corruption that had shaped the towns. Development for David Morrison. The investigation finally provided the answers he'd been seeking about his family's fate. His great-grandfather and the other opposition leaders were reburied with full honors in the town cemetery, and a memorial was erected at the site where they had been murdered. The case taught me that historical truth is often inconvenient, and that communities will sometimes go to extraordinary lengths to avoid confronting uncomfortable facts about their past. But it also showed that the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, often through the efforts of individuals who refuse to accept sanitized versions of events. David Morrison's determination to expose his family's murder led to the discovery of a systematic cover-up that had lasted for nearly a century. His unauthorized museum exhibits may have been illegal, but they succeeded in forcing a community to acknowledge the violence and corruption that had been hidden in its history. The investigation also revealed how organized crime had operated in small towns during Prohibition, using legitimate businesses and local corruption to hide massive criminal enterprises. The bootlegging operation in Millbrook had been sophisticated and far-reaching, involving transportation networks, political connections, and enforcement mechanisms that included kidnapping and murder. The mass grave in the state forest served as a reminder that even in small, peaceful communities, terrible crimes can be committed and then hidden for generations. The families who disappeared in the 1920s had been murdered for opposing what they thought was just an environmental threat, not knowing that they were actually challenging a much more dangerous criminal enterprise. David Morrison's quest for historical truth had revealed not just the story of his family's murder, but the broader pattern of violence and corruption that had shaped Millbrook's development during a crucial period in its history. The phone call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in December. Mrs. Elizabeth Santos, an elderly parishioner at St. Catherine's Catholic Church, was calling about strange sounds she'd been hearing during her evening prayers. "Officer Torres, I know this might sound silly, but I think someone is living in the church basement," she said, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "I've been hearing voices and movement down there during the late evening mass, but Father Kowalski says it's just the old building settling." Mrs. Santos had been attending evening services at St. Catherine's for over 30 years. She knew every creak and sound the old building made, and what she'd been hearing recently was definitely not normal settling. "It sounds like people talking," she explained. "Not just one person, but several people having conversations. And sometimes I hear what sounds like furniture being moved around." I knew Mrs. Santos well enough to take her concerns seriously. She was sharp, observant, and not prone to imagining things. If she said there were people in the church basement, there probably were. Catherine's was a beautiful old stone church built in 1897, with a large basement that housed the parish hall, kitchen facilities, and storage rooms. The basement was used for community events, church suppers, and various parish activities, but it should have been empty during evening services. "When did you first notice these sounds?" I asked. "About 6 weeks ago," Mrs. Santos replied. At first, I thought it was just preparation for the Christmas pageant or some other church event. But when I asked Father Kowalski about it, he seemed uncomfortable. He said I shouldn't worry about basement activities during Mass, that I should focus on my prayers instead. Father Kowalski's evasive response was concerning. In my experience, parish priests were usually happy to discuss church activities with longtime parishioners. His reluctance to explain what was happening in the basement suggested he was hiding something. I decided to investigate, starting with a visit to Father Kowalski during regular office hours. Father Kowalski was a man in his early 50s who had been serving St. Catherine's Parish for about 8 months. He'd been transferred to Millbrook from a larger parish in the state capital, officially as part of a routine rotation of clergy assignments. When I met with him about Mrs. Santos's concerns, his reaction was defensive and dismissive. "Mrs. Santos is a dear woman, but she tends to worry unnecessarily," he said. "Old buildings make all kinds of sounds, especially during winter when the heating system is working harder. I'm sure what she's hearing is just normal building noises." But when I asked if I could take a look at the basement to put Mrs. Santos's mind at ease, Father Kowalski became visibly uncomfortable. "That won't be necessary," he said quickly. "The basement is being used for storage right now, and it's quite cluttered. I wouldn't want you to trip and injure yourself." Father Kowalski's refusal to allow me access to the basement raised immediate red flags. Most clergy members would welcome law enforcement assistance in addressing parishioners' concerns, especially something as simple as checking for intruders. I decided to return to the church during evening mass to conduct my own surveillance of the basement area. What I observed confirmed Mrs. Santos's suspicions. During the 7 p.m. service, I positioned myself outside the church and listened for sounds coming from the basement level. I could clearly hear voices and movement that couldn't be explained by normal building sounds or heating system operations. More significantly, I noticed that there was a separate entrance to the basement at the rear of the building, and that this entrance was being used by people who were arriving and leaving during the evening service. I watched as several individuals entered through the rear basement door while Mass was in progress upstairs. The people using the basement entrance didn't look like typical parishioners. They were well dressed but moved with the kind of caution that suggested they didn't want to be observed. They arrived in expensive cars with out-of-state license plates and stayed for exactly 1 hour before leaving separately. I ran the license plates and discovered that the vehicles were registered to businesses and individuals from major cities across the Northeast: New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. These weren't local church members attending evening services. The pattern was consistent over several nights of observation. During each evening mass, between 5 and 8 people would arrive at the basement entrance, spend exactly 1 hour inside, and then leave. They never entered the main church, never interacted with the regular parishioners, and never stayed beyond the duration of the upstairs service. Whatever was happening in the church basement was being deliberately scheduled to coincide with evening mass, using the religious service as cover for the real activity taking place below. I decided I needed to get inside the basement to see what was happening during the following Sunday's morning service, when I knew Father Kowalski would be occupied with conducting Mass. I gained access to the church basement through a window that showed signs of recent use. What I found there was unlike anything I'd expected. The basement had been converted into a sophisticated meeting facility. The parish hall had been partitioned into smaller rooms, each equipped with soundproofing, recording equipment, and comfortable seating arranged in a conversational layout. One room contained a large conference table surrounded by leather chairs, while another had been set up like a high-end lounge with sofas and a bar. But most disturbing were the recording devices and surveillance equipment that had been installed throughout the space. Hidden cameras and microphones were positioned to capture every conversation that took place in the basement, and the equipment was connected to digital recording systems that could store and transmit the captured audio and video. The basement had been turned into an elaborate surveillance operation disguised as a church meeting space. I found evidence of what these meetings were about in a file cabinet hidden behind a false wall in one of the storage rooms. The files contained detailed records of conversations that had taken place in the basement over the past 6 months, along with background information on the participants. The meetings were being attended by high-level government officials, corporate executives, and political figures who came to the church basement to discuss sensitive matters that they couldn't risk having overheard in their normal offices or meeting places. Topics discussed included upcoming legislation, government contracts, regulatory decisions, and political appointments. The participants believed they were meeting in a secure, private location where their conversations couldn't be monitored or recorded. They were wrong. Every conversation was being captured and documented by whoever was running the surveillance operation. The recordings were being used to gather intelligence on government decision-making, corporate strategies, and political planning at the highest levels. But who was behind this operation? And what were they doing with the information they were collecting? The answer was in Father Kowalski's private office, which I searched after discovering the surveillance equipment. Father Kowalski wasn't actually a priest. His real name was Michael Rodriguez, and he was a former intelligence operative who had been placed in the parish as part of an elaborate espionage operation. The fake Father Kowalski had been recruited by a foreign intelligence service to establish surveillance operations in small American communities where high-level officials might feel safe to discuss sensitive matters. The church basement operation was just one of several similar facilities that had been established across the country. The choice of a church as cover was deliberate and strategic. Religious institutions were generally trusted and respected in small communities, and clergy members were often seen as discreet confidants who could be trusted with sensitive information. A parish priest requesting privacy for church meetings would rarely be questioned or investigated. The operation had been running for 8 months, during which time it had successfully recorded hundreds of hours of conversations involving federal officials, state legislators, corporate executives, and political operatives who thought they were meeting in a secure location. The intelligence gathered from these recordings was being transmitted to foreign handlers who used the information to influence American political and economic decisions. The operation represented a sophisticated foreign intelligence penetration of American government and business at the highest levels. When we arrested the fake Father Kowalski, he initially tried to maintain his cover, insisting that he was a legitimate priest who had no knowledge of any surveillance equipment. But faced with the evidence we'd collected, he eventually admitted to his real identity and the nature of his mission. "You have no idea how easy it was," he told us during interrogation. "Americans trust their clergy implicitly. Once I was established as the parish priest, people would tell me things they would never share with anyone else. And when I suggested that certain sensitive conversations might be better held in the privacy of the church basement, they were grateful for the discreet meeting space." The operation had been so successful that his handlers were planning to expand it to other communities, using the same model of placing fake clergy in trusted positions, where they could gather intelligence on local and national leaders. The investigation expanded into a major counterintelligence operation involving the FBI, CIA, and other federal agencies. The church basement surveillance operation was part of a much larger foreign intelligence network that had been operating in the United States for several years. Other similar operations were discovered and shut down, leading to the arrest of dozens of foreign operatives who had been posing as clergy, teachers, social workers, and other trusted community members. Father Kowalski, or Michael Rodriguez, was convicted on federal espionage charges and sentenced to life imprisonment. The real Father Kowalski, whose identity had been stolen, had been murdered 2 years earlier to facilitate the replacement operation. Catherine's parish had to undergo extensive counseling and rebuilding to recover from the betrayal of trust that the fake priest represented. Many parishioners struggled with the knowledge that their spiritual leader had been a foreign spy who had violated their trust in the most fundamental way possible. The church basement was completely renovated and the surveillance equipment removed, but the damage to the parish's sense of security and trust was irreparable. The knowledge that their most private conversations and confessions had been recorded and transmitted to foreign intelligence services created lasting trauma for many community members. Mrs. Santos, whose alertness had led to the discovery of The operation was commended by federal authorities for her role in exposing the surveillance network. But she struggled with the knowledge that her beloved church had been used for such purposes. "I keep thinking about all the people who came to Father Kowalski for counseling or confession," she told me after the arrest. "They trusted him with their deepest secrets and most private problems. The betrayal goes beyond espionage. It's a violation of the sacred trust that makes faith communities possible." The case taught me that foreign intelligence services had become increasingly sophisticated in their penetration of American communities, using trusted institutions and respected social roles to gain access to sensitive information and influential individuals. The operation at St. Catherine's succeeded for as long as it did because it exploited fundamental assumptions about trust, privacy, and security that Americans take for granted in their daily lives. The idea that a parish priest might be a foreign spy was so unlikely that no one thought to question the new clergyman's credentials or activities. The case also demonstrated how small communities can become targets for sophisticated intelligence operations, particularly when those communities serve as meeting places or retreat locations for high-level officials who want to conduct business away from the scrutiny of major metropolitan areas. The basement of St. Catherine's had been chosen specifically because it was located in a small, trusting community where unusual activities would be less likely to attract attention and where a new priest would be welcomed without extensive background investigation. The Foreign Intelligence Service behind the operation had understood that Americans often felt most secure and private in religious settings, making churches ideal locations for gathering intelligence on sensitive conversations and personal secrets. The violation of that trust represented not just an espionage operation, but an attack on the fundamental social bonds that hold small communities together. Willowbrook Lane was everything you'd want in a small-town neighborhood. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained houses, children playing safely in yards while parents chatted over fences. It was the kind of place where people moved to escape the chaos of city life and raise their families in peace and security. So, when the complaints started coming in about the new family that had moved into 1247 Willowbrook Lane, I was initially skeptical. The Hendersons seemed like model neighbors, quiet, polite, always willing to help with community events. Their house was immaculately maintained, their children were well behaved, and they participated enthusiastically in all the neighborhood activities. But according to several longtime residents of Willowbrook Lane, there was something unsettling about the Henderson family's perfection. The first complaint came from Janet Morrison, who lived directly across the street from the Hendersons. Janet had been on Willowbrook Lane for 15 years and knew the rhythms of neighborhood life better than anyone. "Officer Torres, I know this sounds crazy," she said during our phone conversation, "but I think the Henderson family is watching us, all of us all the time." Janet explained that she'd noticed Mr. Henderson always seemed to be outside when she was getting her mail, walking her dog, or working in her garden. Mrs. Henderson would appear at her window whenever Janet had visitors or received deliveries. The Henderson children would mysteriously show up to play whenever other neighborhood kids were outside. "At first, I thought they were just being friendly," Janet continued. "New neighbors trying to fit in and get to know everyone. But it's been 6 months now, and their behavior hasn't changed. They're still watching, still monitoring everything that happens on our street." The second complaint came from Dr. Robert Chun, who lived 2 houses down from the Hendersons. Dr. Chun was a retired psychiatrist with a keen eye for unusual behavior patterns. The Henderson family's interactions with neighbors follow a script. He told me, "Their conversations are too perfect, too calculated. They ask specific questions about people's routines, their work schedules, their family relationships. It feels like an interview disguised as neighborly chat." Dr. Chun had started paying attention to the Hendersons' behavior after his wife mentioned feeling uncomfortable around them. Mrs. Chun had tried to develop a friendship with Mrs. Henderson, but she found the relationship strangely one-sided. Mrs. Henderson asks lots of personal questions, but never shares anything meaningful about herself or her family. Dr. Chun explained, "When my wife tries to learn about their background, their previous home, or Mr. Henderson's work, Mrs. Henderson deflects the conversation back to questions about our family." The third complaint was the most disturbing. It came from teenage Sarah Kim, who had been babysitting for several families on Willowbrook Lane for the past 2 years. "The Henderson kids know things they shouldn't know," Sarah told me during our meeting at the library, away from the neighborhood where she was afraid the family might overhear our conversation. According to Sarah, the Henderson children, twin boys around age 10, had made comments during neighborhood play that suggested they knew intimate details about other families' private lives. They'll say things like, "Your dad was really mad at your mom last night," or "Your sister's boyfriend isn't supposed to come over when your parents aren't home," Sarah explained. When the other kids ask how they know these things, the Henderson boys just smile and say they pay attention. Sarah was convinced that the Henderson family was somehow spying on their neighbors, gathering information about their private lives and personal relationships. I decided to investigate these complaints. Starting with a background check on the Henderson family, what I found was both reassuring and troubling. The Hendersons' paperwork was all in order: driver's licenses, voter registration, school enrollment for their children, utility connections, and a legitimate mortgage on their house. Mark Henderson worked as a regional sales manager for a medical equipment company, which explained his flexible schedule and frequent travel. Linda Henderson was a freelance graphic designer who worked from home, but when I dug deeper into their background, I found gaps and inconsistencies that raised questions about their real identity. The previous address listed on their mortgage application led to an apartment complex in Ohio that had no record of the Henderson family ever living there. The references they'd provided for their mortgage and rental history couldn't be verified. The phone numbers were disconnected, and the addresses didn't exist. Most puzzling was their employment history. Mark Henderson's employer confirmed that he worked for them, but they had no record of him working for any previous companies, despite his resume showing 15 years of experience in medical sales. Linda Henderson's graphic design portfolio included work for clients who claimed they'd never hired anyone by that name. The Henderson family's background before moving to Millbrook was either fabricated or carefully obscured. I decided to conduct surveillance of their activities to see if their behavior matched their neighbors' concerns. What I observed over several weeks confirmed that the Hendersons were indeed engaged in systematic observation of their neighbors. But their methods were far more sophisticated than simple nosiness. The Henderson house was positioned at a corner location that provided sight lines to most of the other homes on Willowbrook Lane. The family had installed what appeared to be decorative exterior lighting and landscaping features that actually concealed sophisticated surveillance equipment. Hidden cameras were positioned to monitor the front and side yards of neighboring houses, while directional microphones disguised as garden decorations could pick up conversations from adjacent properties. The Hendersons had essentially turned their home into a surveillance command center that could monitor most of the activity on their street. But the surveillance wasn't random. The Hendersons were systematically gathering intelligence on their neighbors' daily routines, work schedules, financial situations, personal relationships, and family dynamics. I watched as Mark Henderson used his morning jogging routine to conduct close observation of neighbors' homes, noting when people left for work, what cars they drove, and what packages they received. Linda Henderson's dog walks served a similar purpose, allowing her to approach neighbors' houses and observe details about their lifestyle and activities. The Henderson children were being used as intelligence assets as well. Their eagerness to play with other neighborhood kids gave them access to information about families' private lives that adults would never share openly. But what was the purpose of this comprehensive surveillance operation? The answer became clear when I intercepted communications between Mark Henderson and his handlers. The Henderson family were professional intelligence operatives, working for a private security firm that specialized in background investigations and due diligence research for corporations and government agencies. Willowbrook Lane had been chosen as a surveillance target because several residents worked in sensitive positions or had access to valuable information. Dr. Chun was a former government psychiatrist who had worked with classified programs. Janet Morrison's husband was a senior software engineer for a defense contractor. Sarah Kim's father was a financial analyst who handled investment portfolios for high-net-worth clients. The Henderson family's mission was to gather intelligence on these targets' personal lives, looking for vulnerabilities, financial irregularities, security risks, or blackmail material that could be used by their clients. "We're not doing anything illegal," Mark Henderson explained during his interrogation. "After we arrested the family, we're conducting legitimate background research using publicly available information and normal social interactions." But the Hendersons' activities went far beyond legitimate research. They were using illegal surveillance equipment to monitor private conversations and activities inside their neighbors' homes. They were manipulating their children to extract confidential information from other families. And they were using their position as trusted neighbors to gain access to personal and financial information that would normally be protected. Investigation revealed that the private security firm employing the Hendersons was working for clients who included foreign corporations, political opposition research groups, and organized crime figures who needed intelligence on specific targets. The information gathered by the Henderson family was being sold to clients who used it for corporate espionage, political blackmail, and criminal extortion. The seemingly innocent neighborhood surveillance operation was actually feeding intelligence to a network of criminals and foreign agents. The case expanded when we discovered that the Henderson family was just one of several similar operations being conducted by the same security firm. Fake families had been placed in residential neighborhoods across the country, using the cover of normal suburban life to conduct intelligence gathering on targeted individuals. The firm had perfected the art of creating completely convincing family units that could integrate seamlessly into residential communities while conducting sophisticated surveillance operations. The operatives were trained in social engineering, surveillance technology, and intelligence analysis, making them far more effective than traditional private investigators. Mark and Linda Henderson were convicted on federal charges including conspiracy, illegal surveillance, and identity fraud. Their children, who had been unaware of their parents' true activities, were placed in protective custody and eventually adopted by relatives who had no connection to the intelligence operation. The other residents of Willowbrook Lane required extensive counseling to deal with the violation of privacy and trust they had experienced. Many families moved away from the neighborhood, unable to feel secure in their homes after learning that their most private moments had been monitored and recorded. The case led to federal legislation regulating the use of residential surveillance operations and requiring disclosure of intelligence gathering activities in residential areas. But the damage to the affected families was permanent. They would never again feel completely safe and private in their own zone. Dr. Chun, who had been one of the primary targets of the surveillance operation, summarized the impact best. Home is supposed to be the one place where you can be completely yourself, where you don't have to worry about being watched or judged. When that sanctuary is violated, when you learn that your most private moments have been observed and recorded by people you trusted as neighbors, it changes your relationship with the world fundamentally. The Henderson house stood empty for over a year after the family's arrest. When it was finally sold, the new owners had to completely renovate the property to remove all traces of the surveillance equipment that had been built into its structure. Case taught me that the line between legitimate investigation and illegal surveillance had become increasingly blurred in an era of advanced technology and sophisticated social engineering. The Hendersons had used methods that were technically legal-friendly conversation, public observation, and social interaction to gather intelligence that would have required warrants and court orders if collected by law enforcement. But the real lesson was about the vulnerability of suburban communities to infiltration by trained operatives who understood how to exploit the trust and openness that make neighborhood life possible. The Hendersons succeeded for as long as they did because they understood that Americans expect their neighbors to be genuine, honest people who respect privacy and boundaries. The perfect neighborhood facade had hidden a sophisticated intelligence operation that violated every assumption residents had about privacy, security, and trust in their own homes. WMIL 104.7 had been Millbrook's only radio station for over 40 years, broadcasting from a small studio above Murphy's hardware store on Main Street. The station played classic rock during the day, local news and community announcements in the evening, and featured a late-night call-in show that had become something of a local institution. Midnight Confessions with Danny Walsh aired from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. every weeknight, offering listeners a chance to call in anonymously and share their thoughts, problems, or secrets with Danny and the late-night audience. It was the kind of small-town radio that fostered community connection and provided comfort to insomniacs, night shift workers, and anyone dealing with problems they couldn't discuss during daylight hours. Danny Walsh had been hosting the show for 8 years, building a loyal following of regular callers who treated him like a trusted friend and confidant. His warm voice and non-judgmental approach made people feel safe sharing their deepest concerns, from marital problems to financial stress to family secrets. They'd never told anyone else. So when several listeners started calling the police station to report that something seemed wrong with Danny's show, I paid attention. The first call came from Margaret Foster, a retired nurse who had been listening to Midnight Confessions since it started. Margaret often worked late on her quilting projects and relied on Danny's show for company during the lonely hours. "Officer Torres, I think someone is impersonating Danny Walsh on the radio," she said during our phone conversation. "The voice sounds like him, but the things he's saying aren't right." Margaret explained that over the past month, Danny's responses to callers had become increasingly inappropriate and invasive. Instead of offering comfort and support, he was asking probing questions about callers' personal lives, requesting specific details about their relationships, finances, and family situations. Last night, a woman called about problems with her teenage daughter, Margaret continued. Instead of giving advice, Danny kept asking for the daughter's name, where she went to school, what time she came home from school each day. When the caller seemed uncomfortable, Danny convinced her that he needed those details to give proper advice. The second complaint came from Robert Kim, whose wife had been a regular caller to the show for several years. Mrs. Kim suffered from anxiety and insomnia, and Danny's show had been a source of comfort during her difficult nights. "My wife started acting strange after calling Danny's show last week," Robert told me. "She seemed scared, paranoid. She kept saying that Danny knew things about our family that she'd never told him. When I asked her to explain, she said Danny had mentioned details about our financial situation and our son's medical problems that she was sure she'd never discussed on the air." The third complaint was the most disturbing. Lisa Santos, a single mother who worked the night shift at the hospital, had been calling Danny's show regularly to talk about the stress of raising 2 children alone. "Danny started asking me to meet him in person," Lisa explained during our interview. "He said he had resources that could help with my financial problems, but that he needed to discuss them privately rather than on the air. When I asked how he could help, he said he had friends who were looking for reliable people to do special projects." Lisa had declined Danny's invitation to meet, but his persistence had made her uncomfortable. She'd stopped calling the show and had started listening to stations from other cities instead. I decided to listen to several recent episodes of Midnight Confessions to evaluate the complaints myself. What I heard confirmed the caller's concerns. Danny Walsh's show had definitely changed over the past month. While his voice and speaking style remained the same, his approach to callers had become manipulative and predatory. Instead of providing emotional support, Danny was systematically extracting personal information from vulnerable people who trusted him. He asked leading questions designed to reveal callers' weaknesses, fears, and secrets. When callers tried to end conversations or seemed reluctant to share details, Danny used psychological manipulation to keep them talking. Most concerning was Danny's technique of demonstrating knowledge about callers' lives that they hadn't shared on the air. He would mention details about their families, jobs, or personal situations, as if he had access to private information about them. "I know you've been worried about your husband's drinking problem," Danny said to one caller who had never mentioned her husband's alcoholism on previous calls. "These kinds of family issues can be isolating, but you're not alone." The caller seemed surprised that Danny knew about her husband's drinking, but she assumed she must have mentioned it during a previous call, that she'd forgotten about. Danny was using this technique demonstrating knowledge of private information to establish trust and credibility with callers, making them believe he had supernatural insight into their problems, when he actually had access to intelligence about their personal lives. But how was Danny Walsh obtaining this private information about his callers? I decided to investigate Danny's background and recent activities. What I found was troubling. The real Danny Walsh had taken a leave of absence from the radio station 6 weeks earlier, citing health problems and family obligations. He'd left town to care for his elderly mother in another state, and wasn't expected to return for several months. The person currently hosting Midnight Confessions was an imposter using Danny Walsh's identity and voice, but the fake Danny Walsh was so convincing that even the radio station management hadn't realized the substitution had taken place. The imposter had somehow gained access to the studio, Danny's show notes and caller information, and enough recordings of Danny's voice to create a convincing impersonation. I contacted the real Danny Walsh at his mother's home and confirmed that he had no knowledge of anyone taking over his show. He was shocked to learn that someone was broadcasting under his name and using his show format to manipulate his listeners. "Those people trusted me," Danny said during our phone conversation. "They shared their deepest problems with me because they believed I cared about helping them. If someone is using that trust to hurt people, we need to stop them immediately." I worked with the radio station to set up surveillance of the studio during the fake Danny's broadcast hours. What we discovered was a sophisticated operation that went far beyond simple radio impersonation. The fake Danny Walsh was part of a criminal network that specialized in identity theft and fraud, targeting vulnerable individuals. The radio show was being used as a recruitment tool to identify potential victims who could be exploited for financial fraud, extortion, or human trafficking. The imposter had gained access to the radio station by posing as a temporary fill-in host sent by the station's parent company. He'd used forged credentials and letters of authorization to convince the station manager that he was legitimate, and he'd been careful to maintain Danny Walsh's broadcasting style to avoid suspicion. But the fake Danny's real purpose was to use the show's intimate format to gather intelligence on vulnerable community members who could be targeted for various criminal schemes. Callers who revealed financial problems were being set up for loan fraud and investment scams. People who discussed family issues were being targeted for extortion schemes based on their personal secrets. Individuals who seemed isolated or desperate were being recruited for criminal activities or human trafficking operations. The fake Danny had been recording all conversations with callers and sharing the recordings with criminal associates who used the information to develop targeting strategies for each potential victim. The operation was sophisticated and far-reaching. The criminal network had infiltrated radio stations in at least 6 different small towns, using the same method of replacing trusted local hosts with imposters who could gather intelligence on vulnerable community members. Small-town radio shows were ideal targets because they fostered intimate relationships between hosts and listeners, creating an environment where people felt safe sharing personal information. The criminals understood that people would trust a familiar radio voice more readily than they would trust strangers, making the shows effective recruitment tools for various criminal enterprises. When we arrested the fake Danny Walsh during a live broadcast, we discovered that his real name was Michael Rodriguez, no relation to the fake priest from the church case, and he was a professional con artist with expertise in voice impersonation and social engineering. Rodriguez had been trained by organized crime figures to infiltrate community institutions and gather intelligence on potential victims. His specialty was assuming the identities of trusted community figures, radio hosts, clergy members, counselors, and using their credibility to manipulate vulnerable people. People want to believe that the voices they hear on the radio care about them, Rodriguez explained during his interrogation. When someone calls a late-night radio show, they're already in a vulnerable state. They're lonely, scared, or desperate for help. It's easy to exploit that vulnerability when you have the right training and the right cover identity. The investigation revealed that Rodriguez's network had successfully operated similar schemes in dozens of communities across the country, generating millions of dollars through various fraud operations while destroying the lives of hundreds of victims who had trusted the wrong people. The real Danny Walsh returned to Millbrook immediately after learning about the impersonation. He worked with law enforcement to identify callers who might have been targeted by Rodriguez and help them understand that their trust had been violated by a criminal imposter. Many of Danny's regular callers required counseling to deal with the betrayal they felt after learning that someone they'd trusted with their deepest secrets had been planning to exploit them. Some never called the show again, unable to trust that the voice they heard was really Danny Walsh. The radio station implemented new security measures and verification procedures to prevent similar infiltrations in the future. But the damage to the show's intimate community atmosphere was irreparable. The knowledge that their private conversations might be heard by criminals had made many listeners too paranoid to call in. Danny Walsh eventually decided to end Midnight Confessions rather than continue a show that had been permanently tainted by Rodriguez's criminal activities. The show was built on trust, Danny explained during our final interview. People called because they believed they were talking to someone who cared about them and wanted to help. Once that trust is broken, once people start wondering whether the person they're talking to is really who they claim to be, the whole foundation of the show collapses. The case taught me that criminals had become increasingly sophisticated in their ability to infiltrate trusted community institutions and assume the identities of respected local figures. Rodriguez's operation succeeded because he understood that people's guard is lowered when they're interacting with familiar, trusted voices, especially during vulnerable moments. The late-night radio format was particularly effective for criminal recruitment because it attracted people who were isolated, stressed, or dealing with problems they couldn't discuss openly. These individuals were ideal targets for various criminal schemes, and their willingness to share personal information on the air made them easy to research and manipulate. The case also demonstrated how modern technology could be used to create convincing impersonations that could fool even people who knew the real person well. Rodriguez had used voice modification software and extensive recordings of Danny Walsh's broadcast to create an impersonation that was virtually indistinguishable from the original. The violation of trust represented by Rodriguez's operation went beyond simple fraud. It was an attack on the community connections that made small-town life meaningful. The late-night radio show had served as a form of electronic campfire where isolated community members could gather virtually to share their concerns and support each other. Rodriguez had turned that campfire into a trap. using people's need for connection and support to identify and exploit their vulnerabilities. The Millbrook Volunteer Fire Department had been protecting our community for over 70 years, staffed by local residents who donated their time and risked their lives to respond to emergencies. The department operated out of a converted garage on Cedar Street, housing 2 fire trucks, an ambulance, and equipment that was maintained through fundraising efforts and municipal budget allocations. Like most volunteer departments in small towns, Millbrook VFD struggled with recruitment and retention. The demands of firefighting and emergency medical response required extensive training and significant time commitments that many residents couldn't accommodate. So when Chief Robert Martinez announced that the department had recruited 6 new volunteers over the summer, the community was thrilled that the new volunteers seemed ideal candidates. They were young, physically fit, and eager to serve. They attended training sessions enthusiastically, participated in community events, and quickly integrated into the close-knit culture of the fire department. But by October, some of the veteran firefighters were beginning to express concerns about the new recruits. The first complaint came from Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a 10-year veteran who served as the department's training coordinator. Sarah was responsible for ensuring that all volunteers met certification requirements and maintained their skills through regular practice sessions. "Officer Torres, there's something strange about our new recruits," she said during our conversation at the fire station. "They're almost too good at certain aspects of the job, but they seem to lack basic knowledge that any firefighter should have." Sarah explained that the new volunteers demonstrated advanced skills in areas like structural assessment, hazardous materials handling, and emergency communications that typically required years of experience to develop. But they struggled with fundamental firefighting techniques and seemed unfamiliar with standard equipment and procedures. "It's like they've been trained for specialized operations, but never learned the basics," Sarah continued. "When we practice standard house fire scenarios, they seem lost. But when we drill on complex emergency situations, chemical spills, structural collapses, mass casualty events, they perform like seasoned professionals." The second concern came from Captain Mike Torres, no relation, who had noticed unusual behavior during actual emergency calls. "The new volunteers always seem to know things about the emergencies before we arrive on scene," Captain Torres explained. "They'll mention details about the location, the people involved, or the nature of the emergency that weren't included in the dispatch information." He described a recent house fire where one of the new volunteers had correctly predicted that they would find an elderly resident trapped in a back bedroom, even though the initial call had only reported a structure fire with no information about occupants. When I asked how he knew to check that specific location, he said he had experience with similar fires, Captain Torres continued. "But the layout of that house was unique. There's no way he could have known about that bedroom unless he'd been inside the house before." The third and most disturbing complaint came from Dr. Patricia Williams, the emergency room physician who worked closely with the fire department's medical response team. "Some of the new volunteers seem to have medical knowledge that goes beyond their training level," Dr. Williams told me. "They're making treatment decisions and using terminology that suggests advanced medical education, but their certifications show only basic EMT training." Dr. Williams described an incident where one of the new volunteers had correctly diagnosed a stroke victim and administered treatment that probably saved the patient's life. But the diagnostic techniques he used and the medications he administered required training that he supposedly didn't have. When I asked him about his medical background, he claimed he'd learned everything through online courses and self-study, Dr. Williams continued. But the interventions he performed require hands-on training and clinical experience that can't be obtained through internet research. I decided to investigate the backgrounds of the 6 new volunteers, starting with their application materials and training records. What I found was concerning. All 6 recruits had similar backgrounds: military, veterans with emergency response experience who had recently moved to the Millbrook area. Their paperwork was complete and professional, but when I tried to verify their military service records and previous employment, I encountered the same problems I'd seen in other cases. The military units they claimed to have served with had no record of their service. The emergency response organizations they listed as previous employers couldn't confirm their employment. Even their personal references provided phone numbers that were disconnected or led to voicemail boxes that were never answered. Like the other cases I'd investigated, the new fire department volunteers appeared to have fabricated their entire professional backgrounds. But why would someone go to such elaborate lengths to join a volunteer fire department? The position offered no salary, required significant time commitments, and involved genuine physical danger. What could motivate someone to assume false identities just to become volunteer firefighters? The answer came when I observed the volunteers' activities outside of their fire department duties. The 6 recruits were conducting systematic surveillance of Millbrook's infrastructure and emergency response capabilities. They were mapping the locations of utility lines, communication systems, transportation networks, and government facilities. They were documenting security procedures, response times, and coordination protocols used by local law enforcement and emergency services. Most significantly, they were gathering intelligence about the personal lives and backgrounds of key community leaders, including police officers, government officials, and business owners who played important roles in Millbrook's emergency response and crisis management systems. The volunteer fire department position gave them legitimate access to all of this information. As emergency responders, they were allowed into secure facilities, given access to communication systems, and included in planning meetings for emergency preparedness and disaster response. But they weren't using this access to improve emergency services. They were gathering intelligence for a planned attack on the community. I discovered the true nature of their mission when I intercepted communications between the fake volunteers and their handlers. The 6 recruits were advance operatives for a domestic terrorist organization that was planning to conduct a major attack on Millbrook as part of a larger campaign against small-town America. The organization believed that small towns represented the traditional American values and social structures that they opposed. They had chosen Millbrook as a target because of its demographic profile, its geographic isolation, and its symbolic value as a representative small American community. The attack was planned to occur during the annual Harvest Festival in late October, when the town would be crowded with visitors and emergency response resources would be stretched thin. The fake volunteers had been gathering intelligence to ensure that the attack would cause maximum casualties and disruption while overwhelming the community's ability to respond effectively. The plan involved simultaneous attacks on multiple targets throughout the town: the water treatment plant, the electrical grid, the hospital, the school, and several residential neighborhoods. The attackers intended to create chaos and terror that would serve as propaganda for their extremist ideology while demonstrating the vulnerability of small American communities. The fake volunteers had been placed in the fire department specifically to sabotage emergency response efforts during the attack. They would ensure that fire trucks and ambulances were disabled or redirected away from the attack sites, preventing effective response to the emergencies they had helped create. When we arrested the 6 fake volunteers, we found evidence of extensive planning for the attack, including detailed maps of target locations, timing schedules for the various assault teams, and communication protocols for coordinating the multi-site operation. We also discovered that the domestic terrorist organization had infiltrated volunteer emergency services in at least 8 other small towns across the country, using the same method of placing trained operatives in positions where they could gather intelligence and sabotage response efforts during planned attacks. The organization had identified volunteer fire departments as ideal infiltration targets because they were typically understaffed, relied on minimal background checking, and provided access to critical infrastructure and emergency response systems. The arrests led to a federal terrorism investigation that ultimately prevented attacks on multiple communities and resulted in the dismantling of the terrorist network. But the psychological impact on the Millbrook community was severe and lasting. The knowledge that their volunteer fire department had been infiltrated by terrorists who were planning to attack their families and neighbors created a level of paranoia and mistrust that took years to overcome. Community members questioned whether other volunteers and public servants might also be terrorists in disguise. Chief Martinez, who had recruited the fake volunteers, struggled with guilt over not detecting their true purpose. He implemented extensive new screening procedures for volunteer recruitment, but the damage to the department's reputation and community trust was significant. "We always believed that people who volunteer to risk their lives for their neighbors must be good people," Chief Martinez explained during our post-incident interview. The idea that someone would join a volunteer fire department specifically to help kill the people they're supposed to protect challenges everything we believe about community service and civic duty. The case led to federal legislation requiring enhanced background checks for volunteer emergency responders and establishing protocols for sharing intelligence about potential terrorist infiltration of emergency services. But the deeper lesson was about the vulnerability of civic institutions that rely on trust and voluntary participation. The domestic terrorist organization had understood that Americans expect their volunteer firefighters to be heroic community servants, making fire departments ideal cover for operatives who needed access to critical infrastructure and emergency response systems. The fake volunteers had exploited the community's gratitude and respect for emergency responders to gain access to information and systems they could use to attack the very people who had welcomed them as heroes. The Harvest Festival was canceled that year and wasn't resumed until 2 years later with extensive security measures that fundamentally changed the character of the community celebration. The knowledge that the festival had been chosen as a target for mass casualty terrorism made it impossible to maintain the innocent, trusting atmosphere that had made the event special. The case taught me that domestic terrorism had evolved beyond individual attackers or obvious extremist groups to include sophisticated organizations capable of long-term infiltration and intelligence-gathering operations. The fake volunteers had demonstrated patience, discipline, and operational sophistication that rivaled foreign intelligence services. Most disturbing was the realization that the attackers had specifically targeted small-town communities because they represented American values and social structures that the terrorists opposed. Millbrook hadn't been chosen because of any strategic importance. It had been chosen because it symbolized the kind of community that the terrorists wanted to destroy. The volunteer fire department continued operating, but with enhanced security measures and background checking procedures that made spontaneous community participation much more difficult. The requirements for becoming a volunteer became so extensive that recruitment became even more challenging than it had been before the infiltration. The community's ability to trust newcomers and welcome volunteers was permanently damaged by the knowledge that people who seemed like ideal community servants might actually be planning to kill their neighbors. I want to share with you began in March, during what should have been a routine local election season. Millbrook's school board had 3 open seats, and for the first time in over a decade, there were more candidates than positions available. Normally, school board elections in small towns are quiet affairs, with low voter turnout and candidates who are well-known community members with obvious qualifications and motivations. But the 2019 election was different. 3 of the candidates were newcomers to the community, and their campaigns were unusually well-funded and professionally organized. The first candidate was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who claimed to be a former university administrator with expertise in educational reform. Her campaign emphasized modernizing the curriculum, improving test scores, and bringing innovative teaching methods to Millbrook schools. The second candidate was Robert Thompson, who presented himself as a business consultant with experience in organizational efficiency and budget management. His platform focused on reducing administrative costs, eliminating wasteful spending, and running the school district more like a business. The third candidate was Maria Santos, who said she was a former teacher and parent advocate who wanted to ensure that local families had a stronger voice in educational decisions. Her campaign emphasized parental rights, traditional values, and community control over school policies. All three candidates seemed qualified and well-intentioned, but their campaigns raised questions among longtime residents who were accustomed to knowing everyone who ran for local office. The first concern was raised by Helen Rodriguez, who had served on the school board for 12 years and was running for re-election. Helen was familiar with every educator, administrator, and parent activist in the region, but she'd never heard of any of the three new candidates before they filed their paperwork to run. Officer Torres, these people appeared out of nowhere, Helen told me during our conversation at the library. I've been involved in local education issues for 20 years, and I know everyone who cares enough about schools to run for the board. These three candidates have no history of involvement in our schools or our community. Helen had tried to research the candidates' backgrounds and credentials, but she'd encountered the same problems I'd seen in my other investigations. Their professional histories couldn't be verified, their references were unreachable, and their claims about previous involvement in education couldn't be confirmed. The second concern came from Principal Davidson at Millbrook Elementary before his arrest in the fake teacher case. Davidson had been contacted by all three candidates requesting detailed information about school operations, student demographics, and district finances. Their questions were very specific and very sophisticated, Davidson told me. They weren't asking the kinds of general questions that concerned parents or civic-minded citizens typically ask. They wanted detailed data about enrollment patterns, testing methodologies, budget allocations, and personnel policies. Davidson had been particularly puzzled by Dr. Walsh's questions about student psychological services and special education programs. She'd requested information about which students received counseling, what kinds of interventions were used, and how student records were maintained and shared. Dr. Walsh said she wanted to evaluate the effectiveness of our student support services, Davidson explained. But her question seemed more focused on how the services worked and who had access to student information rather than whether they were helping kids. The third concern was more subtle but equally troubling. Several parents had reported that the three candidates were conducting unusually extensive door-to-door campaigning, asking detailed questions about families' backgrounds, financial situations, and relationships with the school district. They're not just asking for votes, explained Janet Morrison, whose family had been visited by all three candidates. They're conducting what feels like interviews, asking about our jobs, our income, our children's academic performance, even our relationship with teachers and administrators. Janet described campaign visits that lasted much longer than typical. Political conversations with candidates who seemed more interested in gathering information about families than in explaining their own qualifications or platforms. I decided to investigate the three candidates' backgrounds and campaign activities. What I found confirmed the community's suspicions. All three candidates had fabricated their professional histories and personal backgrounds. Dr. Walsh had never worked in university administration. Robert Thompson had no experience in business consulting, and Maria Santos had never been a teacher or parent advocate. But unlike the other cases I'd investigated, these fake identities served a different purpose. The three candidates weren't trying to infiltrate the school system to commit crimes or gather intelligence for external organizations. They were part of a much more insidious operation designed to gain control of local government institutions through electoral fraud, The investigation revealed that all three candidates were employees of a political consulting firm that specialized in manipulating local elections in small communities. The firm had been hired by a coalition of corporate interests and political organizations that wanted to influence education policy at the grassroots level. The strategy was sophisticated and far-reaching. By placing their operatives in school board positions across multiple small towns, the consulting firm could implement coordinated policy changes that would serve their clients' interests while appearing to be the result of local democratic decision-making. The party of local democratic decision-making. Specific goals varied depending on the client, but they included implementing standardized testing programs that benefited particular education companies, adopting curriculum materials produced by specific publishers, and modifying disciplinary and counseling policies to create markets for private contractors. Dr. Walsh's interest in student psychological services, for example, was related to her clients' plans to privatize school counseling and mental health programs. Once elected, she would have voted to eliminate in-house counseling staff and replace them with services provided by private companies that her consulting firm represented. Robert Thompson's focus on budget efficiency was designed to justify cuts to programs and services that would then be replaced by private alternatives offered by his clients. His business expertise was fake, but his knowledge of how to dismantle public services and create markets for private replacements was very real. Maria Santos's emphasis on parental rights and traditional values was intended to generate controversy and division within the community, creating political conditions that would allow the other candidates to implement their agenda, while parents were distracted by cultural conflicts. The three candidates had been carefully chosen and trained to appeal to different segments of the Millbrook community, ensuring that at least one of them would be elected regardless of which issues dominated the campaign. But the operation went beyond simple electoral fraud. The consulting firm was gathering detailed information about community members and their children that would be valuable for future political operations and commercial marketing. The door-to-door campaigning and detailed questioning about families' backgrounds was actually intelligence gathering designed to create comprehensive profiles of residents that could be used for targeted political messaging, consumer marketing, and social manipulation. The firm had developed psychological profiles of every family in Millbrook, identifying their political preferences, economic vulnerabilities, and personal concerns that could be exploited in future campaigns or commercial solicitations. We arrested the three fake candidates. We discovered that their operation was part of a national network that had successfully manipulated local elections in over 40 small towns across the country. The consulting firm had been operating for several years, gradually building a network of controlled local officials who could implement coordinated policy changes that served corporate and political interests. The firm's clients included education companies, testing services, curriculum publishers, and technology firms that wanted to expand their markets in public schools. They also included political organizations that wanted to influence education policy to advance ideological goals related to curriculum content, teaching methods, and school governance. The investigation revealed that the firm had successfully placed operatives on school boards, city councils, and other local government bodies in dozens of communities, creating a shadow network of fake officials who appeared to be serving local interests while actually implementing coordinated policies designed by distant corporate and political powers. The operation represented a sophisticated attack on democratic governance at the local level, where Americans traditionally expect their elected officials to be genuine community members who are accountable to their neighbors. Dr. Walsh, Robert Thompson, and Maria Santos were convicted on federal charges including election fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft. The consulting firm was shut down, and its clients faced investigation for their role in the election manipulation scheme. But the damage to Millbrook's democratic institutions was severe and lasting. The knowledge that their school board election had been manipulated by outside interests made many residents question the legitimacy of all local elections and the authenticity of all political candidates. The three legitimate candidates who had been running against the fake ones had to overcome suspicion that they might also be plants or imposters. Longtime residents found themselves questioning the backgrounds and motivations of neighbors they had known for years. The school board election was delayed for 6 months, while new security measures were implemented and the candidate pool was thoroughly vetted. When the election was finally held, voter turnout was historically low, with many residents expressing doubt about whether their votes would actually matter in determining the outcome. Helen Rodriguez, the incumbent school board member who had first raised concerns about the fake candidates, won re-election but struggled to restore trust in the school board's decisions and policies. When people learned that an election they participated in was fake, that the candidates they evaluated and the issues they considered were all manufactured by outside manipulators, it damages their faith in democracy itself, Helen explained during our post-incident interview. The case led to federal legislation requiring enhanced verification of candidates' backgrounds in local elections and establishing penalties for organizations that engage in systematic electoral fraud. But the broader implications of the operation were more difficult to address through legal remedies. The consulting firm had demonstrated that small-town democracy was vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation by well-funded outside interests. Local elections, which Americans traditionally viewed as the purest form of democratic participation, could be compromised by operatives who understood how to exploit communities' trust and assumptions about political candidates. The case also revealed how corporate and political interests had learned to use local government positions as entry points for implementing broader policy agendas. By controlling school boards, city councils, and other local bodies, they could influence policy at the grassroots level, while avoiding the scrutiny that would accompany similar efforts at state or federal levels. The three fake candidates had been trained to appear as authentic local voices, while actually serving as instruments of distant corporate and political powers. Their success would have allowed outside interests to control education policy in Millbrook while maintaining the facade of local democratic decision-making. The investigation showed that this strategy was being implemented systematically across the country, with consulting firms placing fake candidates in local elections throughout small-town America. The goal was to create a network of controlled local officials who could implement coordinated policies that served corporate and political interests while appearing to be the result of grassroots democratic processes. The case taught me that modern political warfare had evolved to include sophisticated attacks on local democratic institutions that had traditionally been considered too small and insignificant to attract outside manipulation. The consulting firm had understood that Americans expect their local elected officials to be genuine community members with authentic motivations for serving their neighbors. By violating that expectation, they had struck at the foundation of democratic governance at its most basic level. The fake school board candidates represented a new form of political terrorism, an attack on the democratic process itself that was designed to make citizens doubt the authenticity of their own local institutions and the legitimacy of their own political participation. Asterisk 10 cases. 10 different ways that evil learned to hide behind respectable facades in a small town, where everyone was supposed to know everyone else. Each case taught me something different about the evolution of crime in modern America and about the vulnerability of communities that pride themselves on trust, openness, and neighborly cooperation. The photography studio showed me how predators use trusted institutions to access victims, exploiting the very trust that makes community life possible. Palmer's attempt to preserve his uncle's crimes demonstrated how evil can span generations, with new perpetrators arising to continue the work of their predecessors. The book club revealed how psychological manipulation can be disguised as intellectual activity, with criminals using their expertise to steal the very memories that make people who they are. Margaret Holloway's memory experiments showed that some forms of violence leave no visible wounds, but destroy their victims just as thoroughly as physical abuse. The Wellness Center proved that medical credentials and professional authority can be weaponized against vulnerable people seeking help. Dr. Vasquez's operation demonstrated how sophisticated criminal enterprises can use legitimate-seeming businesses to hide human trafficking and systematic exploitation. The fake teacher case illustrated how modern criminal organizations conduct intelligence operations against ordinary families, using children as unwitting agents against their own parents. Miss Hartwell's systematic gathering of blackmail material showed how predators had learned to exploit institutional trust to access potential victims. The town historian case taught me that historical truth can be both weapon and shield, with individuals like David Morrison using guerrilla tactics to expose cover-ups while others work to maintain comfortable lies about the past. The mass grave in the state forest served as a reminder that even the most peaceful communities can harbor terrible secrets. The church basement operation revealed how foreign intelligence services had learned to exploit Americans' religious faith and trust in clergy to gather sensitive information. The fake Father Kowalski's surveillance network showed that even our most sacred institutions could be infiltrated and used against us. The Perfect Neighborhood demonstrated how professional intelligence operatives could pose as ideal families while conducting systematic surveillance on their neighbors. The Henderson family's operation proved that privacy and security in our own homes could be illusions when sophisticated criminals understood how to exploit suburban social dynamics. The radio show Imposter showed how modern technology could be used to create convincing false identities that could fool even people who thought they knew the real person. Rodriguez's manipulation of vulnerable listeners demonstrated how criminals could weaponize the intimate connections that people form with trusted media personalities. The volunteer fire department infiltration revealed how domestic terrorists had learned to use civic service as cover for planning attacks on the communities they pretended to serve. The fake volunteers operation showed that even our most heroic institutions could be turned into weapons against us. The school board election fraud illustrated how democratic institutions at the local level could be manipulated by outside interests, seeking to control policy while maintaining the appearance of grassroots decision-making. The fake candidates operation demonstrated that even our most fundamental political processes could be compromised by well-funded corporate and political manipulation. Each case followed a similar pattern: sophisticated criminals with professional training and substantial resources had learned to infiltrate trusted institutions and assume respected social roles to facilitate their criminal activities. They understood that Americans' assumptions about community life, institutional trust, and social roles could be exploited to gain access to victims and avoid detection. But the cases also revealed a more disturbing truth about the evolution of crime in the 21st century. These weren't random criminals taking advantage of convenient opportunities. They were part of coordinated networks, human trafficking organizations, foreign intelligence services, domestic terrorist groups, political manipulation firms that had identified small-town America as a target-rich environment for their operations. The isolation that protected small towns from urban crime also made them vulnerable to sophisticated criminal enterprises that could operate with minimal oversight. The trust that bound communities together could be weaponized by criminals who understood how to exploit that trust. The institutions that provided safety and security could be infiltrated and turned into instruments of predation. Most disturbing of all was the realization that these criminal networks had studied American small-town life carefully enough to understand exactly how to exploit its vulnerabilities. They knew which social roles commanded automatic trust which institutions had minimal security oversight, which community values could be manipulated for criminal purposes. The criminals in these cases weren't outsiders trying to break into closed communities. They were skilled operatives who had learned to become insiders, to assume the very roles and identities that communities most trusted and respected. They became the teacher parents entrusted with their children's education, the priest parishioners trusted with their deepest secrets, the doctor patients relied on for healing, the neighbor families welcomed into their lives, the radio host listeners confided in during their most vulnerable hours, the firefighter the community counted on for protection, the candidate voters supported for democratic representation. In each case, the criminals succeeded for as long as they did because they understood that Americans, especially Americans in small towns, want to believe that people who assume positions of trust and responsibility are genuinely committed to serving others rather than exploiting them. That faith in human goodness and civic responsibility is what makes democratic communities possible. But it's also what makes those communities vulnerable to predators who understand how to exploit that faith. The 10 cases I've shared represent only the ones I encountered directly during my time as a police officer in Millbrook. I have no doubt that similar operations were occurring in other small towns across the country, many of which were never detected or investigated. The criminals had learned that small towns were ideal targets because they combined maximum vulnerability with minimal oversight. Rural police departments were understaffed and undertrained for dealing with sophisticated criminal enterprises. Local institutions relied on trust rather than verification. Community members assumed that familiar faces and respected positions guaranteed good intentions, but the cases also showed that small-town communities had strengths that criminals couldn't completely overcome. In every case, the initial detection of criminal activity came from alert community members who noticed when something didn't feel right. Mrs. Henderson observing lights in an abandoned building, Janet Weber's neighbor noticing her changed behavior, Marcus Webb questioning his medical treatment. The crimes were ultimately solved because ordinary citizens were willing to report their concerns to law enforcement, even when those concerns seemed minor or difficult to explain. Community members who knew their neighbors well enough to notice when behavior patterns changed, who paid attention to details that might seem insignificant to outsiders, who trusted their instincts when something felt wrong. The cases taught me that the best defense against sophisticated criminals is an informed, alert, and connected community. People who know each other well enough to recognize when someone is acting out of character. Neighbors who pay attention to unusual activities and are willing to report their concerns. Citizens who ask questions when professionals or officials make requests that seem inappropriate or excessive. But the cases also taught me that even the most alert and connected communities can be vulnerable to criminals who understand how to exploit the very qualities that make community life meaningful: trust, cooperation, willingness to help others, faith in institutions and social roles. The criminals succeeded for as long as they did because they understood something fundamental about human nature. People want to believe that others are good, that institutions can be trusted, that communities are safe places where neighbors look out for each other, that faith is essential for civilization to function. But it's also what makes civilization vulnerable to those who would exploit and destroy it. The 10 cases represent 10 different ways that evil learned to wear the mask of good, to assume the roles and identities that communities most trust and respect. They show how predators evolved from crude criminals who announced their intentions through obvious violence to sophisticated operators who could hide behind professional credentials, institutional authority, and social respectability. But they also show that evil, no matter how sophisticated or well disguised, ultimately leaves traces that can be detected by people who care enough to pay attention. Mrs. Santos noticed sounds in the church basement that didn't belong there. Margaret Chun observed that someone was rearranging museum exhibits with suspicious knowledge and purpose. Helen Rodriguez recognized that school board candidates had appeared from nowhere, with no history of community involvement. In each case, the criminal operation was eventually exposed because someone noticed details that didn't quite add up, patterns that seemed wrong, behaviors that violated expectations about how trusted community members should act. The lesson isn't that we should become paranoid or suspicious of everyone around us. The lesson is that we should pay attention to our communities and trust our instincts when something feels wrong, even if we can't immediately explain why. The criminals in these cases counted on community members being too polite, too trusting, or too busy to question authority figures or investigate unusual activities. They succeeded when people ignored their concerns or dismissed their suspicions as unworthy of attention. They were stopped when community members decided to act on their concerns, to ask questions even when those questions might seem rude or intrusive, to investigate even when investigation might reveal uncomfortable truths. The cases also taught me that modern law enforcement must evolve to address the increasing sophistication of criminal enterprises that target small communities. Rural police departments need training and resources to recognize and investigate operations that go far beyond traditional local crime. We need to understand that a suspicious person loitering in a parking lot might be conducting surveillance for a human trafficking operation, that an overly friendly new neighbor might be gathering intelligence for criminal or espionage purposes, that a respected professional might be using their position to exploit vulnerable people in ways that leave no obvious evidence. Most importantly, we need to maintain strong connections with federal agencies that have the resources and expertise to investigate sophisticated criminal networks that operate across multiple jurisdictions. But the ultimate responsibility for community security lies with community members themselves. Law enforcement can investigate and prosecute criminals after their activities are detected, but detection depends on alert citizens who notice when something isn't right and are willing to report their concerns. The cases I've shared show that sophisticated criminals can fool professional investigators, bypass institutional security measures, and maintain their operations for months or years without detection. But they also show that these same criminals can be exposed by ordinary community members who pay attention to details and trust their instincts about human behavior. Mrs. Henderson's observation of lights in an abandoned building led to the exposure of a historical cover-up and the discovery of a mass grave. Marcus Webb's suspicion about his medical treatment led to the dismantling of a human trafficking operation. Mrs. Santos's concern about sounds in the church basement led to the discovery of a foreign espionage network. In each case, a single alert citizen who was willing to report unusual activities or suspicious behavior triggered investigations that exposed sophisticated criminal enterprises. The message is simple: pay attention to your community, trust your instincts when something feels wrong, and don't hesitate to report concerns to law enforcement, even when those concerns might seem minor or difficult to explain. The criminals are counting on your politeness, your trust, and your reluctance to question authority or investigate unusual activities. They succeed when communities are passive, unobservant, or unwilling to act on their suspicions. They fail when communities are alert, connected, and willing to ask questions even when those questions might be uncomfortable or inconvenient. 10 cases represent 10 victories for small-town law enforcement and community vigilance over sophisticated criminal enterprises. But they also represent warnings about the vulnerabilities that exist in every small community across America. The criminals are out there, wearing trusted faces and assuming respected roles, working patiently to exploit the very qualities that make community life meaningful. They understand our weaknesses better than we understand theirs, but we have advantages they can't overcome. We know our neighbors, we understand our communities, and we can recognize when something doesn't belong or doesn't feel right. The question is whether we'll use those advantages to protect ourselves and each other, or whether we'll allow politeness and trust to blind us to the predators who hide among us. The answer to that question will determine whether small-town America remains a refuge from the chaos and danger of modern life, or becomes just another hunting ground for criminals who understand how to exploit our faith in human goodness. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious violence or dramatic crimes. Sometimes it wears a badge, a collar, a white coat, or a friendly smile. Sometimes it lives next door, teaches your children, leads your church, or serves on your local government. The monsters are real, and they're closer than you think. But so are the heroes, ordinary citizens who pay attention, ask questions, and refuse to let their communities become hunting grounds for predators. Stay alert. Stay connected. And remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do for your community is to trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Even when you can't explain why, the darkness is always looking for ways to creep in. But the light is there too, in the form of community members who care enough to keep watch and sound the alarm when evil tries to hide behind the mask of good. Sleep well, but sleep aware. Because in small towns where everyone knows everyone, the most dangerous stranger might be the neighbor you trust the most. Asterisk.